The lamps of Rome still burned as midnight fell, their glow flickering softly against marble walls. In the palace of the emperor, silence seemed to stretch endlessly, yet behind that silence there were whispers. Whispers of power, of secrets, of betrayal, of betrayal. And at the centre of those whispers was a woman whose name would echo through centuries, Messalina. To some, she was Rome's most dangerous seductress, an empress of lust and betrayal. To others, she was a victim of history's cruel storytelling. Tonight, we will walk slowly into her world, through the candlelit corridors of Rome, not in haste, but as if in a dream, learning how a young woman rose to become an empress, and how desire and ambition could change the fate of an empire. Chapter 1. The stage of Rome. The lamps still burned along the Palatine when the city took its slow, careful breath. Marble softened in the lamplight. Bronze statues, blackened by countless winters, kept their patient watch. The Tiber moved in a steady, whispering sigh, carrying with it the scent of fish and reeds and the faint smoke of distant kitchens. If you listened very closely, Rome at night sounded less like a great beast and more like a sleeping household. 1,000 small noises folded gently into one another. A dog's distant bark, the scrape of a cart on a quiet street, the soft murmur of a sentry at his post. It was in that hush, between lamp and shadow, between the city's many voices, that the small stage of imperial life waited to be shown. Rome in those years was an enormous, imperfect poem. By day it was glorious and messy, the forum full of senators in their white togas, the market stalls bright with olives and figs and bolts of cloth, the baths steaming with talk, and the scrape of oil on skin. By night it became a different kind of beauty. Corridors held more secrets than business, and the sounds were those of servants moving like tides, closing shutters, folding up the noise of the day into the heavy quiet of the domus. The city's heart was not a single place, but many. A palace on the Palatine, a poor insula packed with families, a temple where the faithful came to lay down their wishes. All of them were parts of the same slow-turning world. At the very top of that world, where marble steps led to small gardens and private pools, the imperial palace kept its own private evening. The palace was at once a house and a theatre, a place where state and household, desire and decree folded into one another. In daylight, the emperor's face might be a public mask, the ruler who read dispatches, who received envoys, who posed for the eyes of Rome. At night, the mask could be set aside. Yet even those private moments were watched, at least by rumour. Freedmen who carried messages through the rooms, guards who stood like stones at vigilant posts, wives and sisters who learned the art of silence and the language of half-words. The politics of Rome were practiced like a careful game played on fine boards. Senators spoke in measured sentences, gestures measured and rehearsed. The proud families of old Rome kept their dignity like a heavy cloak. But beginning in the years before our story, new threads had been woven through this cloak of tradition. Servants who had once been ignored now held keys. Freedmen with sharp minds and sharper tongues walked corridors with the emperor's confidence. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's soldiers, whispered their own judgments in private rooms. Power did not always announce itself openly. Often, it leaned forward in a smile, or rested in a whisper, And yet, for all the outward ceremonies, the life of Rome itself, its markets and its temples, its private gardens and noisy taverns, went on in ways that felt familiar across the city. There were mornings when the forum roared like a marketplace of ideas, lawyers arguing, merchants calling prices, orators inflating small words into great moments. There were afternoons when baths took over the conversation, where men lay back on warm marble and spoke of law and poetry, of land and debt, of jokes and rivalries. There were evening conviviums, long dinners where reclining bodies listened with one ear and plotted with the other, where the bread was soft and the wine turned words into silk. In every household there was also the quieter life, the slow work of being a Roman wife or mother or daughter. The Roman matron, the woman of an elite house, moved in a world where honour was a garment to be preserved. She was expected to be pudica, modest and discreet, the keeper of her family's reputation. Yet the reality of the city, always more complicated than its laws and moralists, allowed many kinds of power to flow through those domestic spaces. Women managed estates, supervised slaves, and guided alliances with the smallest gesture. They could be the steady centre of a home, the secret advisor of a husband, or the quiet mover of political threads from behind a curtain. If the law and the songs spoke of modesty, the true rule of Rome was the skill of who could bend the rules without breaking them. The Julio-Claudian line, a family whose name still landed like an ancient bell in the ears of Rome, cast a shadow over all of this. Generations of emperors, each with their own triumphs and their own peculiar human flaws, had transformed the old republic into a place where the emperor's household often decided more than the proud Senate could. Names were remembered, a founder who reorganized the city and embroidered his own name into every corner, rulers whose tempers and private obsessions became public news, an emperor known as Caligula, whose whimsy and cruelty made many hold their breath. Into that long, complicated memory stepped a more cautious figure, one whose outward awkwardness hid the machinery of empire. The emperor wore the purple and sat behind walls, but his household moved like the hands beneath a tablecloth, setting plates, sliding whispers. It is important, before the next lights go down, to notice how rumour travels in Rome. The city loved a story. A single gesture could become a scandal. A word overheard could become a play to be repeated in taverns and on steps for days. Ancient historians, the men who wrote the lives of emperors long after their deaths, loved these stories too. They collected them as one might gather pebbles on a shoreline, some bright, some ordinary, some polished by time, others jagged and sharp. When later readers open those histories, they will find the story of an empress woven with both careful record and rumour. The truth then, as now, sits somewhere between the two. Into this rich and dangerous tapestry arrived the young women of the city, daughters who were taught to be both ornaments and instruments. They learned needlework and household law, the careful bow of a head and the measured laugh at a dinner. They learned, too, that marriage was rarely a private matter. It was a joining of households, an exchange of names and estates and political hopes. A girl born into privilege carried her family's fortunes like a coin, sewn into her garment. She might be a path to greater wealth, to a friend in the Senate, to the ear of an important man. The families raised daughters like small ships, ready to sail when the right wind came. One such daughter, born into one of Rome's many noble lines, would someday cross the threshold into the palace. Her name had not yet become a thing people said in gossip, or carved upon tablets of history. For now she existed as a bright figure in a wider crowd, a girl who learned the art of speech and concealment, who watched the slow choreography of dinner parties and whispered counsel. Enjouffée. She would be taught how to make a hand seem indifferent even when her heart was going faster. She would learn how to wear her laughter like a veil. Such skills were not mere performance, they were survival. When she came to the palace, she would find a court full of small dangers and even smaller triumphs. There, every smile could be an instrument, every favour could be currency. Friends became allies, lovers sometimes became stumbling blocks, and the emperor's sheathing of a robe might make or break a household. The palace lived on soft pleasures, music and wine, jasmine and perfumed oils, and on harder things, rivalry and jealousy, the precise counting of favours, the endless calculation of who owed what to whom. The more delicate a person's touch, it seemed, the more leverage they might gain. But in these rooms, the line between influence and arrogance was thin, and it could break without warning. As the city slept and the lamps guttered their soft light, Rome held its breath as it always did before a story began. There was not yet a great storm, nor a single violent slam of fate. Rather, there was an accumulation of small things. A glance held too long, a favour remembered, a promise made under silken sheets, that would, by degrees, become history. The names carved into bronze did not always tell how those names were made. Sometimes they were made in sleepless nights, in slow whispers, in the quiet exchange of a nod across a crowded room. So it was that the stage was set, a city of stone and sound and soft lights, a palace whose rooms kept the secrets of an empire, families whose fortunes rose and fell like the daily tide. The characters of the place were many. Senators who measured their words, freedmen who knew the shape of the emperor's desires, soldiers who watched the city's pulse, women who learned to hold power by small gestures. In the next steps of our quiet journey, we will follow one of those women, see how she learned the slow arts of influence, and watch as the small things of the palace multiplied into consequences. For now, let the lamps dim a little further. Imagine the shallow pools in the emperor's garden where moonlight fell across lotus leaves. Imagine curtains drawn, servants moving like soft shadows. Imagine the city settling, each house a separate universe of warmth and quiet. The stage is ready. The actors have taken their places. Rome breathes on, patient and indifferent as any great city, while history, gentle as a tide, prepares to move. The city of Rome was never truly silent. Even when the lamps burned low, even when the vast bulk of the population retreated into courtyards and cramped apartments, there remained a faint murmur, as if the stones themselves whispered the stories they had gathered. Imagine the city beneath a pale moon, its temples rising like solemn guardians, its aqueducts gleaming faintly as silver ribbons stretched across the land. A traveller walking late on those cobbled streets might have heard the distant clip of hooves from a patrol, or the weary laughter of men leaving a tavern, or the soft rustle of women drawing their shawls tighter as they hurried home. Rome at night was not the blinding spectacle of midday, but rather a softer, slower world. Lanterns swung outside bakeries that promised fresh bread in the morning. Guards stood at their posts along the Palatine, their polished helmets catching stray shards of moonlight. And in the poorer quarters, the Suburra and beyond, there were fires in iron braziers where families warmed themselves against the cool air. The rich reclined in their villas, perhaps surrounded by oil lamps carved with scenes of gods, their courtyards perfumed by roses and watered plants. The poor, meanwhile, crowded together in wooden tenements where the floorboards creaked under too many feet and the air was filled with the mingled scents of cooking, smoke, and humanity. To fall asleep in Rome was to be lulled, not by silence but by texture. 1,000 fragments of life overlapping like notes in a soft song. The barking of dogs, the creak of wagon wheels, the occasional cry of a vendor still selling fish or bread. Children curled up beside mothers, labourers stretched sore limbs and dreamed of wages. The city never truly lay still, for Rome was both body and mind, both muscle and memory, always awake in some part of itself. By day the city's energy was different, bursting with brightness and clamour. Dawn began not with peace but with motion. Carts rattling through gates, vendors setting out their wares, priests sweeping temple steps, water carriers trudging with sloshing buckets from the fountains. The sun rose over tiled rooftops and painted the city's countless statues with warm light, as if the gods themselves were stirring. Rome was a city of noise, hoofbeats and hammers, laughter and curses, a constant roar that poured from markets, streets, and forums. The Forum Romanum, the city's beating heart, was already alive by the hour after sunrise. Senators wrapped in snowy white togas, their purple stripes marking status, passed gravely along the paving stones. Lawyers, with voices polished through endless practice, raised disputes and argued before clusters of onlookers. Merchants haggled with customers. Slaves carried messages between households, their sandals slapping hurriedly against the stone. There was always an air of spectacle. Statues glimmering in sunlight, basilicas rising with columns and marble friezes, temples heavy with offerings and the smell of incense. The Forum was part law court, part marketplace, part theatre, and part rumour mill, a place where the powerful performed their roles and the humble watched, learned and whispered. Not far from there, ordinary Romans lived their patterned lives. Bakers worked through the night to ensure hot loaves were ready at dawn. In the early hours, customers crowded into their shops to purchase bread, the staple that sustained rich and poor alike. At the baths, which opened by mid-morning, men and women separated into different halls, stripping off the dust of the streets, immersing themselves in warm waters, and talking about everything from philosophy to the price of fish. Children chased one another in narrow lanes, watched carefully by mothers whose eyes were always measuring, always protective. The city smelled of many things, some pleasant and some less so, roasting meats drifting from taverns, the salty tang of the Tiber, perfumes wafting from wealthier households, and the more pungent odours of drains, animals, and humanity pressed close together. Yet to Romans, these were not contradictions but parts of a whole. The noise, the smell, the sheer closeness of the city gave it life. When evening came, Rome shifted again. Wealthy households gathered for the convivium, the dinner party, where couches were arranged in a U-shape and guests reclined as slaves served them roasted game, honey cakes, and cups of wine. There were musicians strumming, poets reciting, and talk drifting between gossip and politics. But even beyond the gilded villas, the evening meal was central to Roman life. Families of modest means gathered around clay lamps, sharing bowls of stews or bread with cheese, sometimes olives or dried figs when fortune allowed. The poorest, crowded in their insulae, might purchase hot food from street vendors, lentils, porridge or small fish fried crisp. The act of eating together, however simple or grand, was the glue of the Roman household. The social fabric of Rome was woven from endless layers: patricians and plebeians, freedmen and slaves, senators and soldiers. At the very top glittered the emperor and his court, remote but also intimately present, for every decision that trickled down from the Palatine touched the lives of countless ordinary people. A law passed, a tax levied, a favour granted. These things determined the rhythms of work and rest, of hunger and fullness, of life and death. Yet for the average Roman, life was lived in smaller cycles. A trip to the market, a visit to the baths, the festival days that sprinkled the year with celebration. Religion, too, shaped daily existence. Shrines to household gods, the lares and penates, stood in kitchens and courtyards, their small statues blackened by smoke from years of offerings. Each morning Romans poured a few drops of wine, offered a morsel of food, or lit incense, keeping alive the invisible ties between family and the divine. Larger festivals filled the streets with processions and games, sacred days when temples overflowed with sacrifices and priests recited long chants. For many Romans, the gods were not distant abstractions but companions woven into the fabric of life, present in the rustle of leaves, the roll of dice, the outcome of a trial. The poor, who made up most of Rome's population, found joy where they could. The theatre offered comedies and tragedies where actors in masks exaggerated the follies of daily life. The circus, with its roaring chariots, provided a spectacle that bound the city together. Senators and shoemakers alike all swept into the thunder of wheels and the shouting of the crowd. Even gladiatorial games, though grim, carried a hypnotic attraction, a reminder of Rome's power and the thin veil between life and death. For all its grandeur, Rome was a city of contrasts. Rich villas with mosaic floors and painted walls stood not far from alleys where children played barefoot among refuse. Marble temples caught the sun while wooden tenements leaned precariously above narrow lanes. The Tiber carried both barges of imported grain and the refuse of the city. Beauty and squalor, majesty and fragility, lived side by side, as inseparable as day and night. It was within this constant ebb and flow, this mixture of noise and silence, of grandeur and poverty, that the imperial household kept its vigil. On the Palatine Hill, the emperor's palace stood like a separate city within a city. Its gardens overlooked the forum and the circus. Its halls echoed with footsteps of freedmen, scribes, and guards. There was always movement, officials bringing reports, servants carrying platters of food, messengers hurrying with sealed documents. Yet there was also stillness, the kind that comes when power is concentrated in a few hands, when decisions made in silence ripple outward to affect millions. Night settled differently there. While ordinary Romans blew out their lamps and folded into sleep, the palace glowed faintly with torches and oil lamps. Guards kept their stations, their armour glinting. Slaves padded softly through corridors, tending to fires or carrying water. Behind curtained chambers, the emperor might rest, but his household remained alert, for the affairs of empire did not wait for the sun. The atmosphere was heavy with secrecy. Freedmen who served as secretaries wielded more power than many senators, for they controlled the flow of information. Courtiers and relatives lingered in shadowed rooms, speaking in whispers, aware that the walls themselves seemed to listen. It was here, in this blend of grandeur and suspicion, that the dramas of power unfolded. The daily life of Rome, both ordinary and exalted, was thus a preparation, a stage on which every actor, whether baker or senator, played a role. The city, like a vast theatre, echoed with countless stories, most forgotten, some immortalized. Within this theatre, the figure of a young woman was preparing to step into the light. She would walk from the background of noble lineage into the very heart of imperial life. For now she was unnamed, one among many daughters of patrician houses, but soon her presence would fill the palace. Soon her choices, her passions, and her betrayals would ripple outward through all of Rome. And so, as the moon lingers above tiled roofs and the Tiber carries its soft murmurs into the night, we pause. The city sleeps uneasily, full of voices and secrets, preparing for the story of an empress whose name will not fade. This is Rome at night, restless, luminous, eternal. The empire did not belong to one man alone. It carried within it the weight of generations, a tapestry woven with both triumph and misstep. To understand the world into which Messalina would rise, one must wander gently back through the line of rulers who shaped Rome's first imperial century, the Julio-Claudians. They were not merely emperors, they were the architects of a new order, men whose personal lives spilled over into public consequence, whose family ties entangled the fate of millions. No, their shadows lingered long over the city, their names murmured in the Senate, in marketplaces, in taverns, even at quiet dinner tables. The story began with Augustus, though he was not born by that name. To the people he was Octavian first, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who inherited not just a fortune, but a mantle of destiny. Through careful patience, through war and strategy, through the soft persuasion of words, Octavian reshaped Rome from a republic cracked by civil war into an empire wrapped in order. He was the first emperor, though the title was disguised. He preferred princeps, the first citizen, a name that suggested modesty even as it cloaked supreme power. Under Augustus, the empire breathed in peace after decades of bloodshed. Temples rose, laws were codified, the city was polished like marble under a careful hand. Yet beneath the calm surface, ambition and rivalry never ceased, for the old Roman families still dreamed of influence, and the new imperial household became the pivot of all politics. Augustus's reign was long, and the city grew accustomed to the idea of a single man standing above the Senate, guiding armies, balancing provinces. When he died, after more than 4 decades of rule, the empire felt both grief and uncertainty. Who would follow? The delicate web of succession had been tugged at many times, possible heirs chosen and lost, until at last it was Tiberius, the dour stepson of Augustus, who wore the purple. Tiberius was no stranger to command. He had led legions, secured frontiers, and shown the stern discipline of a soldier. Yet as emperor, he carried an air of melancholy, a reluctance as though the power was a cloak too heavy to wear comfortably. He governed with efficiency, sometimes with suspicion, retreating more and more from public life into his villa on the island of Capri. Rumours followed him there, whispers of cruelty, of indulgence, of dark pleasures in secluded chambers. Whether true or embroidered, these stories coloured the people's image of him. Rome was always quick to fill silence with scandal. Still, his reign endured for more than 2 decades, a testimony to the structures Augustus had built and to Tiberius's own cold discipline. After Tiberius came Gaius, whom history remembers by a childhood nickname, Caligula, a little boot. At first the city rejoiced. He was young, he was the great-grandson of Augustus, and he promised a return of energy and delight. But delight quickly turned to unease. Caligula's reign was brief and notorious. He indulged whims with a reckless hand, emptied treasuries, raised temples to himself, and treated the Senate not as partners but as playthings. The ancient writers, Tacitus and Suetonius and Dio, left behind images of madness, of the emperor appointing his horse as consul, of extravagant banquets, of cruelty disguised as jest. Whether exaggerated or not, the memory of Caligula became a warning of what happened when unrestrained desire sat on the throne of Rome. His assassination by the Praetorian Guard, after only a few years, proved how fragile even imperial power could be when stretched too far. In the wake of his death, confusion reigned. Senators debated whether the empire might return to the old republic, but the soldiers had other ideas. Hidden in the palace, trembling behind curtains, they discovered Claudius, uncle of the slain Caligula, a man thought by many to be weak, timid, even foolish. He had lived much of his life in the shadow of others, mocked for his limp, his stammer, his awkwardness. But the Praetorian Guard lifted him up, acclaimed him emperor, and the Senate could do little but assent. Claudius, however, proved less foolish than many believed. Behind his physical frailties lay a mind trained in history, a patience honed by years of survival. He valued scholars, reorganized administration, and sought to strengthen the empire's foundations. He extended Roman power into Britain, a conquest that would echo for centuries. Reorganized administration. Yet his rule was not free from danger. Because he had come to power through the army rather than the Senate, he relied heavily on freedmen, imperial secretaries and advisors, men of low birth, who now wielded immense influence. This upset the old families, who grumbled at their exclusion. The palace became a place of rivalries, of careful alliances, of whispers that might decide life or death. It was within Claudius's reign that Messalina would rise. She was not just any noblewoman, she belonged to the same Julio-Claudian line, though from a younger branch. though from a younger branch. Her family ties wove her fate inseparably into the imperial fabric. To Rome, bloodline was both blessing and burden. To be kin of Augustus was to carry expectation and scrutiny alike. Every gesture, every word, every rumour was magnified, for it reflected not only on the individual but on the dynasty itself. The Julio-Claudian household was therefore more than a family. It was the stage upon which the empire played out its dramas. Marriages were political weapons. Children were pawns and heirs. Women became the unseen architects of alliances, their modesty proclaimed but their influence quietly acknowledged. In the marble corridors of the Palatine, one could feel the weight of generations pressing down, shaping choices, whispering reminders of past triumphs and failures. By the time Claudius took the throne, Rome had already seen the full spectrum of emperors. The careful statesman Augustus, the melancholy disciplinarian Tiberius, the reckless Caligula, each had left marks on the city's memory, scars and hopes alike. Now with Claudius a new chapter began, one where scholarship and caution mixed uneasily with vulnerability. He was a man who leaned on others, freedmen, guards, and above all, his wives. In that reliance lay both strength and danger, for the closer one stood to the emperor, the more easily one might sway him, and the more easily one might fall. And so the empire entered a quieter rhythm. Claudius read dispatches, signed decrees, expanded provinces, and dined in the palace with his household. Senators murmured and adjusted, courtiers sought favour, and ordinary Romans continued their bustling lives, largely indifferent to the finer intrigues of the Palatine. And yet, within those walls, destiny coiled itself around a young empress who would soon transform private whispers into public scandal. Messalina's world was thus framed by the Julio-Claudian legacy, by Augustus's grand vision, by Tiberius's suspicion, by Caligula's wildness, and by Claudius's unexpected rule. She inherited a Rome accustomed to power concentrated in one household, a Rome that expected its rulers to be both human and divine, a Rome eager for stories of passion and betrayal. And into this Rome she stepped, carrying her lineage like a crown and a chain all at once. In the grand stories of Rome, the chroniclers so often placed men at the centre. Senators wrapped in their togas, generals astride their horses, emperors upon their marble thrones. Yet if one leaned closer, if one listened to the subtler threads that wove the fabric of daily life, it became clear that women shaped the empire in ways both quiet and decisive. Their power did not always shine in public speeches or military triumphs. It lingered in courtyards, in whispered counsel, in the arrangement of marriages, in the steady stewardship of households that were themselves miniature empires. The ideal Roman matron was praised for her pudicitia, modesty, restraint, devotion to family. Moralists like Livy and Valerius Maximus told stories of ancient matrons who spun wool, kept their domestic tasks, and embodied simplicity. Statues of women were often veiled, a sign of dignity and chastity, their eyes cast downward. This image served the state's desire for order. A modest household mirrored a disciplined society. Yet Rome was never so simple. Beneath the moral codes and carefully polished virtues, women in elite households managed estates, oversaw networks of clients and freedmen, and carried the weight of family reputation upon their shoulders. Marriage in the Roman world was not a private affair of affection alone. It was a contract, a knot binding families together in alliances that carried political and financial consequence. A woman's hand in marriage could shift the fortunes of households, sealing bonds between ambitious senators or cementing ties with imperial blood. To marry well was to position one's family closer to influence. To marry poorly was to risk obscurity or decline. Daughters were thus raised with the knowledge that their lives might be the threads by which fortunes were woven. Within the domus, the great Roman house, the matron presided as both caretaker and manager. She supervised slaves, ensured supplies, managed the education of children, and acted as steward of her husband's reputation. Her presence at dinner parties, her grace in conversation, her ability to hint at loyalty or distaste, all of these mattered. In the delicate game of Roman politics, where rumour often outweighed fact, a woman's behaviour could tilt opinion as surely as a senator's speech. Rumour, indeed, was the true currency of Rome. The city thrived on gossip, passed in markets, murmured in baths, shouted in taverns. A glance exchanged at a banquet could become the subject of a dozen retellings. A woman who lingered too long in the company of another man might be transformed, in the mouths of gossips, into an adulteress. Conversely, A matron whose dignity was praised became a model of virtue, her household exalted by association. This constant exchange of whispers meant that women lived under unblinking scrutiny, but it also meant that those who understood the power of rumour could wield it to their advantage. History remembers several women who did just that. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was celebrated for her modesty, but was also a master of influence. She steered alliances, advised her husband, and shaped the succession of emperors after him. To some, she was the model matron. To others, she was a schemer who hid steel beneath her veil. For Agrippina the Elder, bold and proud, marched with soldiers and spoke against injustice, her reputation both admired and feared. Her daughter, Agrippina the Younger, would later marry Claudius himself and become the mother of Nero, her name synonymous with ruthless ambition. These women remind us that Roman matrons were not merely passive figures. They were forces who could bend history, yet for every admired woman there were also those who became symbols of excess. Writers, almost always men, recorded tales of wives who drank too freely, who entertained too lavishly, who indulged in lovers. Whether true or not, these stories reflected the anxieties of a society that both depended upon women's influence and feared it. To accuse an empress or noblewoman of adultery was a way to tarnish not just her reputation, but the legitimacy of her husband's power. Thus, women stood at the intersection of public and private, praised for virtue but always vulnerable to scandal. In Rome, sexuality itself was tangled with politics. Male infidelity was often tolerated, even expected, while female chastity was guarded with jealous vigilance. A wife's fidelity symbolized the purity of lineage, the assurance that a man's heirs were truly his own. An empress accused of adultery threatened not only her marriage, but the very stability of the dynasty. The whispers of betrayal could erode confidence in the emperor, suggesting weakness, corruption, or divine disfavor. And so the private passions of women became matters of state, their desires and choices scrutinized as if they were decrees. Messalina's story cannot be told without this context. She did not emerge into a vacuum. She stepped onto a stage where women had long wielded influence in both expected and forbidden ways. The precedent of Livia showed how an empress might guide the empire quietly, cloaked in modesty. The boldness of Agrippina the Elder demonstrated that a woman's will could echo in the camps of soldiers, yet the dangers were equally clear. Women who overstepped the delicate boundaries were condemned in the harshest terms, their names preserved not for virtue but for scandal. For Rome, it was easier to turn women into symbols than to grapple with their complexities. A virtuous empress became a goddess of chastity, her image carved into marble and paraded in festivals. A disgraced empress became a cautionary tale, her memory twisted into warnings against lust and ambition. Messalina, as we shall see, would become the latter, remembered by ancient historians less as a person and more as a symbol of corruption. Whether those stories were fully true or shaped by politics and rumour is a question we must carry gently as we wander through her life. The world of women in Rome was, therefore, a paradox. They were celebrated and constrained, powerful and vulnerable, central and marginal. They moved within walls, yet their shadows stretched across the empire. They were told to remain silent, yet their whispers could topple men. In their hands lay the fragile threads of family, honour and legacy, threads that could be woven into tapestries of triumph or tangled into knots of betrayal. As the lamps dimmed in the domus of noble families, one might imagine a young girl lying awake, listening to the soft murmurs of the household. She would know that her life was not wholly her own, that her marriage would one day be chosen, her name linked to ambitions greater than herself. She might dream of gardens and music, but also of corridors heavy with politics, of banquets where every glance mattered. Such was the world into which Messalina was born, a world where the role of women was both circumscribed and immense, and so the stage was prepared. In Rome's endless theatre, where men shouted in the Senate and generals marched on distant frontiers, the quieter power of women shaped destinies. Messalina's tale would not be the first, nor the last, to remind the empire how fragile was the line between modesty and influence, between desire and distraction. She would walk that line with bold steps, and the echoes of those steps would resound far beyond her own lifetime. To understand Messalina, the empress whose name would one day be uttered with both fascination and scorn, we must first return to her beginnings, to the household in which she was born, to the family whose bloodlines carried both privilege and peril, and to the expectations that shadowed her from the very start. Messalina came into the world around the year 17 or 20 C, during the reign of Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome. The empire was still young then, only a few decades removed from the fall of the Republic. The memory of Augustus lingered, a golden age fresh in the minds of the people. Yet beneath that veneer of order lay rivalries and suspicions that entwined the ruling family like tangled roots. Into this atmosphere Messalina was born, a child destined, whether she knew it or not, to be both a participant in and a victim of Rome's dynastic struggles. Her family, the gens Valeria, was among the oldest and most respected of Roman lineages. The Valerii had furnished consuls, generals and statesmen for centuries, their name etched into the annals of the Republic. To be born a Valeria was to inherit a legacy of distinction. Yet what made Messalina's position unique was not merely her patrician heritage, but her connections to the Julio-Claudian house, the ruling dynasty of Rome. Through her mother, Domitia Lepida the Younger, Messalina was tied to the blood of Augustus himself. Her family tree wound through the complicated branches of imperial kinship, making her both privileged and precarious. Domitia Lepida, Messalina's mother, was known in her time as a woman of beauty, wealth and ambition. She was also the sister of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would father the boy later known as Nero. In this way, Messalina and Nero were cousins, both destined to play striking roles in Rome's imperial drama. Domitia's household was one of influence, and her daughter would have grown up surrounded by the chatter of politics, the ceremonies of status, and the expectations of nobility. Of Messalina's father, Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, less is known. He was a nobleman of high standing, descended from a line that had produced orators and magistrates of note. His name, Messala, carried echoes of dignity and tradition, and it was from him that Messalina inherited the name by which she would forever be remembered. Though he died while she was still young, his lineage anchored her within the ancient aristocracy of Rome, adding weight to her already significant position. In the nursery of a Roman noble household, Messalina would have been attended by wet nurses, tutors, and slaves. From her earliest years she was shaped by the rhythms of privilege, the careful arrangement of her clothing, the recitation of stories drawn from the myths of gods and heroes, the observation of religious rites. Roman girls of her class were not educated in the same manner as boys destined for oratory, but they were not neglected either. Messalina would have learned to read and write, to recite poetry, and to appreciate the histories of her ancestors. More importantly, she would have absorbed the skills necessary for her expected role. The management of a household, the comportment of a lady, the delicate art of conversation. Yet to imagine her childhood only in terms of domestic training would be to overlook the atmosphere of the time. Rome under Tiberius was a place of suspicion and surveillance. The emperor, withdrawn to the island of Capri in his later years, governed through advisors and informants. Treason trials flourished, and noble families lived with the constant awareness that their words could be twisted into charges of disloyalty. For a young girl like Messalina, such matters might have been distant, but they formed the air her family breathed. Conversations at dinner, the hushed tones of adults, the sudden disappearance of an acquaintance, these would have impressed upon her the precariousness of power. As she grew, the expectations of her sex and station would have become clearer. Messalina would not fight battles in the field, nor debate in the Senate. Her path lay instead in alliances. A daughter of her bloodline was a prize in the marriage market, a piece in the great game of dynastic politics. From her earliest adolescence, Messalina would have been aware that her future husband would be chosen not for her preference, but for the advantage he brought to her family. The knowledge of such destiny often bred resignation, but it could also instill ambition. A clever young woman might look upon marriage not as a loss of freedom, but as an opportunity to wield influence. What did Messalina herself think in these formative years? The sources do not tell us. Ancient historians recorded little of her before her marriage, and even afterward their accounts are coloured by hostility and scandal. Yet we can imagine a girl walking through the gardens of her family's estate, her hand trailing along the leaves of laurel and myrtle, her eyes absorbing the grandeur of marble statues. She might have listened to stories of her illustrious ancestors and wondered what mark she herself might leave upon history. She might have learned the arts of charm and persuasion, watching her mother host banquets, observing how a well-placed smile or a graceful gesture could shift the mood of a gathering. There is also the possibility that, like many young nobles, Messalina witnessed both indulgence and excess. Rome in the 1st century was a society of contrasts. Stoic philosophers preached restraint while feasts sprawled into midnight revels. Moralists praised modesty while lampoons mocked the lusts of the powerful. A girl growing up amid these contradictions would have learned early how flexible the boundaries of morality could be, how public virtue and private vice often lived side by side. By the time Messalina reached marriageable age, perhaps around her mid-teens, her beauty and lineage made her an attractive prospect. The choice of her husband was momentous, for it would not only secure her own place in society, but also entangle her fate with the destiny of the empire. When she was given in marriage to Claudius, the uncle of the reigning Emperor Caligula, few could have predicted how extraordinary that union would become. Claudius was older, awkward in bearing, dismissed by many as unfit for power. Yet through this marriage Messalina would one day ascend to the throne of Empress, a position that magnified every gesture, every rumour, every passion into the realm of legend. Her early life, then, was both typical and exceptional. Typical in that she was raised as many Roman noble girls were, within the constraints of family honour and societal expectation. Exceptional in that her blood and marriage would carry her into the very heart of imperial power. The patterns of her childhood, the mingling of privilege and pressure, the intertwining of virtue and indulgence, prepared her, perhaps unconsciously, for the role she would play. As we linger on these early chapters of her life, let us do so gently, as if watching a candle flicker in the shadow of marble halls. Messalina was not yet the figure of scandal, not yet the empress of rumour and betrayal. She was still a daughter, a young woman learning her place in the great machinery of Rome. The burdens of empire had not yet pressed upon her shoulders. The whispers of lust and intrigue had not yet stained her name. She was, in these first years, a girl of promise and uncertainty, standing at the threshold of a destiny she could not yet see. And so, in the quiet corridors of her youth, the stage was set. The empire moved restlessly around her, emperors rising and falling, senators scheming, soldiers marching, while she, unaware of the storm to come, grew into the woman who would one day become Empress Messalina. The world awaited her, and history, with all its merciless judgment, had already begun to write her part. Rome was an empire of marble and blood, and at its heart lay a family both exalted and cursed, Julio-Claudians. To speak of them was to summon a saga more tangled than any myth of gods and heroes. In their veins ran the legacy of Augustus, the first emperor who had transformed a restless republic into a world-spanning monarchy. Yet alongside this glory ran rivalries, resentments, and the long shadows of suspicion. For Rome's emperors did not rule as kings in name. They ruled as fragile figures upon a stage where loyalty was thin and ambition plentiful. It is within this troubled dynasty that we must place Claudius, the man who would one day be Messalina's husband. He was not the heir anyone expected, nor the leader anyone imagined. Indeed, for much of his life, Claudius was dismissed, even ridiculed, by his own family. To understand his story, and by extension the story of Messalina, we must first trace the Julio-Claudian drama that unfolded around him. The line began with Augustus, once known as Octavian, the adoptive son of Julius Caesar. Augustus wore the mask of modesty while building the machinery of autocracy. His reign was long and glittering, filled with temples and victories, but it left behind the question of succession. Who would follow him? His bloodline was fragile, his heirs few, and the competition fierce. Augustus's only daughter, Julia, became both a blessing and a curse. Married off in a series of political unions, she carried his legacy forward. Yet her private life, marked by scandal and whispers of adultery, tarnished the careful image Augustus had built. When Augustus died in 14 the throne passed to Tiberius, his stepson. Tiberius was a seasoned general but a reluctant ruler, dour and brooding, never at ease in the role fate thrust upon him. His reign began with competence but soon descended into suspicion. Treason trials multiplied, noble families lived in fear of denunciation. Tiberius himself withdrew from Rome, retreating to Capri, where tales, half rumour, half invention, painted him as a tyrant lost in cruelty and excess. Yet even in retreat, his shadow loomed over the capital. After Tiberius came Caligula, born Gaius, the son of Germanicus, a prince beloved by the people. Caligula's first months as emperor promised joy and renewal, for he was young, charming, and the heir of a popular line. But soon his reign unravelled into chaos. Morbid chaos. Stories tell of extravagance, of wild feasts and impossible demands, of cruelty cloaked in laughter. Whether exaggerated or not, Caligula became the embodiment of capricious power. His assassination in 41 C, carried out by his own guards, revealed how fragile the imperial throne had become. And so we return to Claudius, uncle of Caligula, nephew of Tiberius, great-nephew of Augustus. Claudius had lived in the shadows, overlooked by his family. He was mocked for his stammer, his limp, his nervous mannerisms. Ancient writers tell us that his own mother called him a monster of a man, only half-finished by nature, and his sister is said to have declared that he was a fool, whom nature had begun but never completed. Whether these were cruel exaggerations or kernels of truth, Claudius bore the weight of ridicule throughout his youth. Yet, in being ignored, Claudius survived. While others of the Julio-Claudian house perished in the ruthless struggles for power, accused of treason, poisoned, or exiled, Claudius lived quietly on the margins. He devoted himself to study, to the writing of history, to the company of books, rather than the Senate. He penned works on Etruscan history and Carthaginian wars, immersing himself in the past while the empire convulsed around him. The very traits that made him seem unfit for public life protected him from the fate of his more ambitious relatives. Still, Claudius was not entirely without place. He attended family gatherings, sat at banquets, and watched as one emperor after another rose and fell. He knew the sting of mockery, but also the lessons of caution. He learned how dangerous ambition could be, how fatal the wrong word might become, and though he may not have seemed destined for greatness, he carried within him the blood of Augustus, a fact that no one could ignore forever. The assassination of Caligula in 41 C changed everything. In the chaos that followed, Claudius was discovered hiding behind a curtain in the palace, trembling for his life. Instead of killing him, the Praetorian Guard hailed him as emperor. It was an accident of history, a twist of fate. The man mocked as a fool was now master of the world, but long before that day arrived, Claudius had married. Among his unions was the one with Valeria Messalina, a marriage that bound him to the younger generation of imperial blood. For Messalina, still in her teens, it was a step into a household of both opportunity and danger. For Claudius, it was a match that connected him more firmly to the dynasty's living branches. Their union was not yet the scandal-ridden tale it would become. In its early days, it was simply one thread in the ever-knotted tapestry of Julio-Claudian politics. As we drift deeper into this family's story, let us remember, the Julio-Claudians were not gods, though temples were raised in their honour. They were human beings driven by ambition, envy, love and fear. Yet because they ruled an empire, their private passions became matters of state. Their quarrels shook provinces, their marriages redrew alliances, their feuds decided the fate of nations. In such a family, no life was ordinary, and no choice was without consequence. And within this turbulent web, Messalina would find herself entangled. She entered not merely as a wife, but as a participant in a drama larger than herself, a drama of survival, ambition, and betrayal that had been playing long before she was born. Claudius, as emperor, early reign, character, and Messalina's rising role when the Praetorian Guard lifted Claudius from behind the curtain of the palace and declared him emperor in 41 C. The city of Rome trembled with disbelief. The Senate hesitated, the people whispered, and even Claudius himself must have felt the surreal weight of destiny pressing upon him. For decades he had been the overlooked scholar, the butt of family jokes, the man who limped and stammered and seemed too odd for power. Yet in the chaos left by Caligula's assassination, the soldiers chose him, and their choice held more strength than any senatorial decree. At first, many doubted that Claudius could rule. He had never commanded armies, never held the consulship with distinction, never displayed the charisma of a Caesar. Yet what he lacked in grandeur, he compensated for with persistence, a love of learning, and perhaps the cautious instincts of one who had survived a lifetime of danger by keeping to the margins. He had seen how ambition destroyed his relatives. He had watched men perish by poison, exile, or accusation. He had learned that survival often required patience, humility, and quiet observation. Now, paradoxically, those very qualities became strengths. Claudius surprised his critics. Once in power, he revealed a sharp administrative mind. He listened to advisors, but also made his own judgments. He reformed the bureaucracy, empowered freedmen in his household to manage affairs of state, and paid close attention to the machinery of justice. He expanded citizenship to provincial elites, built aqueducts, repaired roads, and even undertook the conquest of Britain, a feat that won him military glory. His reign, far from being a disaster, brought stability after the chaos of Caligula. Yet it was not without strain, for every decision was scrutinized by senators who resented his reliance on freedmen, and by courtiers who sought to manipulate his trust. Claudius was a man of contradictions. He loved scholarship, filling his hours with histories and treatises, yet he was also drawn to the spectacles of the arena. He could be generous, granting amnesties, and he could be ruthless, ordering executions when he felt threatened. He longed for affection, having been mocked much of his life, yet this longing made him vulnerable to those who offered it. Behind the imperial purple remained the shy, awkward man who had once been dismissed as unfit. Power had elevated him, but it had not erased the loneliness of his youth. Into this fragile space stepped Messalina, his young wife. She was, at the time of his accession, perhaps no older than 20, beautiful and ambitious. Where Claudius was cautious, Messalina was bold. Where he leaned upon books and loyal advisors, she understood the subtler power of charm, seduction, and influence. Claudius adored her, and his trust in her was deep. For a man who had been denied love and respect by much of his family, the devotion of a wife was a bomb. In Messalina he saw a partner who brought not only beauty but also legitimacy. She was connected by blood to Augustus's line, her presence strengthening his claim to rule. The early years of their marriage appeared fruitful. Messalina bore Claudius 2 children, Octavia, a daughter, and Britannicus, a son, whose very name celebrated the conquest of Britain. For an emperor, the birth of a male heir was a blessing, a promise of dynastic continuity. The imperial household, so often shaken by uncertainty, seemed for a brief time secure. Statues were erected, coins struck, festivals held. Rome could look upon the imperial family and see not chaos but stability. An emperor who worked diligently, a young empress who brought forth heirs, and a household that mirrored the ideals of Roman virtue. But beneath this image, the currents of intrigue swirled. Messalina was no passive figure. She understood the politics of the palace, the networks of freedmen, the ambitions of senators, the rivalries that never ceased. She began to weave her own web of influence, whispering into Claudius's ear, arranging favours, promoting allies. Those who sought advancement knew that gifts, loyalty, or flattery directed at the Empress could open doors. She was young, but she was not naive. In a world where women's formal power was limited, Messalina wielded what influence she could: beauty, charm, and access to the emperor's trust. Historians of antiquity would later paint Messalina as insatiable in desire, ruthless in ambition, a woman who manipulated Claudius to her own ends. Yet we must pause, for such portraits were coloured by hostility and scandal, written by men eager to condemn powerful women. What is certain is that Messalina held sway in the palace, and that her presence was felt in decisions great and small. Whether she acted out of love for Claudius, ambition for herself, or loyalty to her family, her role in shaping the reign was undeniable. For Claudius, her influence may have been both comfort and peril. He relied on her, trusted her, and delighted in her youth and beauty. Yet by drawing her close, he also exposed himself to the dangers of rumour and manipulation. In the empire's ceaseless gossip, every gesture of the Empress became fodder for speculation. Was she loyal? Was she faithful? Did she love the emperor, or merely the power he represented? These questions hovered in the minds of senators and alike, questions that would, in time, grow into accusations. In those early days, however, such whispers had not yet become storms. Claudius worked tirelessly to prove himself a capable ruler, while Messalina played the role of empress with grace and authority. Together they presented an image of continuity, for Julio-Claudian dynasty renewed after the madness of Caligula. For Rome, weary of chaos, it was enough to rest, for a moment, in the illusion of stability. Yet illusions are fragile. In the marble corridors of the palace, ambition sharpened its knives. In the gardens, where laughter and wine flowed, secrets passed from ear to ear. And in the private chambers of the imperial household, passions stirred that would one day shake the empire. Messalina's rise had begun, and with it, the long, uneasy entanglement of love, power, and betrayal that would come to define her name. Messalina's influence in court politics, her enemies, and growing tensions in Rome power in Rome was never exercised in silence. It rustled in the corridors of the Palatine, whispered in private dinners, and thundered in the Senate when favours or accusations were laid bare. Claudius, though emperor, could not stand alone in this world of endless intrigue. He needed allies, administrators, mediators, and while he relied heavily on his freedmen, men like Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, it was Messalina who became the most immediate channel of influence within the imperial household. Messalina quickly understood that her beauty and proximity to Claudius gave her leverage. Petitioners who sought imperial favour discovered that doors opened more easily if they pleased the Empress. A senator wishing to secure his son's career, a provincial governor hoping to retain his post, a wealthy freedman seeking contracts, all knew that gifts, flattery, or alliances woven through Messalina could bring their causes before the emperor. Claudius, who trusted his wife deeply, often accepted her suggestions without suspicion. To him, her involvement may have seemed natural. A loyal wife ensuring the smooth running of the household. To outsiders, however, her growing role appeared as manipulation, even corruption. The court became a theatre where Messalina's influence played out. She rewarded friends lavishly, ensuring that her allies gained positions of wealth and honour. At the same time, she was ruthless toward rivals. Ancient writers describe her using whispers, rumours, and accusations to bring down those she disliked. A senator who crossed her might suddenly find himself accused of treason, his estate seized, his family disgraced. While it is difficult to know how much of this is exaggerated by hostile sources, there is little doubt that Messalina, like many at court, played the dangerous game of survival by turning suspicion into a weapon. Enemies began to gather in silence. Some senators resented her power, seeing her as a usurper of male authority. Others envied her family connections and feared the strength she could wield in advancing her relatives. Even within the imperial household, the freedmen who advised Claudius did not always align with her interests. Narcissus, the secretary who managed correspondence, was cautious and loyal to Claudius above all. Pallas, who oversaw finances, had ambitions of his own. Callistus, who handled petitions, cultivated his own networks. Each of these men recognized that Messalina could either be their ally or their rival, and each maneuvered accordingly. Meanwhile, Rome itself was alive with gossip. Stories of Messalina's private desires began to circulate. Ancient sources accuse her of infidelity, of lovers taken in secret, of appetites that shocked the moralists of the day. Whether true or not, such tales had power. The Roman public, fascinated by scandal, delighted in imagining their empress as both seductress and conspirator. For women of high rank, the line between rumour and reality was perilously thin. Messalina's enemies found that they could undermine her not only by political means but also by attacking her reputation. Yet she endured. Her beauty, her youth, and her role as mother of Claudius's heir gave her a shield against attacks. As long as Claudius adored her, and he did, she remained untouchable. Britannicus, their son, was a symbol of continuity, and no senator dared move openly against the Empress while the emperor's favour enveloped her. Still, tensions brewed. Every whisper of scandal weakened her. Every manoeuvre in court that displaced an enemy earned her a grudge. Every display of influence gave ammunition to those who would one day destroy her. The paradox of Messalina's position was that her power rested on foundations both strong and fragile. She was the emperor's wife, the mother of his children, a woman tied to the Julio-Claudian dynasty by blood. Yet all of it depended on Claudius's trust. If ever he wavered, if ever her enemies proved persuasive, the edifice could crumble in an instant. For now, though, she reigned within the palace as its quiet centre. Senators bowed before her influence, courtiers sought her favour, poets whispered of her beauty, and enemies sharpened their knives in secret. The reign of Claudius, so carefully built upon administration and reform, was increasingly shaped by the unseen hand of Messalina, a hand graceful with jewels, yet heavy with consequence. Rome had seen ambitious women before, Livia, Agrippina the Elder, even Caligula's sisters. But Messalina's story would prove more scandalous, more dramatic, and ultimately more tragic. For in the theatre of Roman politics, every rise foretold a fall, and every whisper of rumour carried the seed of ruin. The Palatine Hill, though grand, was not the only stage upon which Messalina lived her life. Beyond the marble halls of the imperial palace stretched gardens that seemed to belong more to dream than to earth. By day, the colonnades glimmered in sunlight. By night, the lamps flickered among fountains, and the air carried the mingled fragrance of roses and cypress. These were places designed not merely for rest, but for performance, where pleasure and politics intertwined like vines upon a trellis, upon a trellis. Messalina walked these gardens with the serenity of one who believed herself secure. She was still young, scarcely more than 20, yet already the mother of Claudius's heir, Britannicus, and of his daughter Octavia. Her status seemed unshakable. When she strolled among the marble statues, the attendants and handmaids followed in hushed reverence, their presence a constant reminder of her position at the very heart of Rome's destiny. Here, away from the formalities of court, Messalina fashioned her own world. Ancient writers describe her as a woman of fierce appetites, and though the truth is clouded by exaggeration, it is clear that she loved beauty, luxury, and power. Banquets in her name stretched deep into the night, where tables overflowed with roasted meats, delicacies from distant provinces, and amphorae of rich wine. Musicians played softly as senators' sons reclined beside poets, and laughter rose into the scented night. It was a world where boundaries blurred between pleasure and duty, between intimacy and politics. For Messalina, such gatherings were not idle indulgence. They were opportunities, a whispered promise here, a subtle nod there. She wove alliances beneath the cover of feasting. Men who thought themselves favoured for their charm or wit often discovered that what truly bound them to the Empress was obligation. A debt of gratitude, a secret granted, a weakness revealed. In this, she mirrored the methods of Rome itself, where power was never naked, but always clothed in layers of courtesy and exchange. Yet rumours spread easily in the Roman world, a city that thrived on gossip as much as on grain. The more lavish Messalina's entertainments, the more tongues wagged in the Suburra and the Senate alike. Stories whispered that the Empress sought not only companionship, but conquest, that lovers were taken and discarded, that her desires were insatiable. Insatiable. Whether fact or invention, such tales gave her enemies fuel, painting her not as a graceful consort, but as a dangerous seductress whose power threatened to overshadow even the emperor himself. Claudius, it seems, either did not know or chose not to see. He adored his wife, trusted her counsel, and took comfort in her presence. Perhaps he believed that gossip was inevitable, that no woman in his position could escape it, or perhaps his own gentle, distracted nature left him blind to the webs she spun. Whatever the case, Rome observed with keen eyes, and the balance between admiration and suspicion shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward fear. Still, within the palace, life went on in rhythms that seemed eternal. Children played in shaded courtyards. Slaves hurried with trays of fruit and scrolls of correspondence. Senators arrived in togas heavy with dignity, hoping for a word with the emperor, or better yet, with the empress. And through it all, Messalina moved like a figure from myth. Beautiful, enigmatic, powerful, and already, though no one yet dared to say it aloud, dangerous. Banquets in the palace were never merely meals. They were gentle wars in which every gesture had meaning, every course a sentence in a longer conversation. Imagine a long table beneath a colonnade, lamps swinging in the warm night air, couches arranged so that conversation could nestle into comfortable bends. Slaves moved like soft shadows, carrying dishes that were little spectacles, peacocks strutting upon platters, dormice sweetened with honey and nuts, oysters from distant coasts, and fishes glazed with the pungent sauce the Romans loved, garum. Platters also carried simpler things, flat loaves of bread still warm from the oven, bowls of lentils and beans, figs and dates, cheeses rubbed with herbs. Wine flowed in amphorae, diluted with water and sometimes spiced with honey or resin, turning talk into a slow, honeyed music. Music came from the corners, flutes, lyres, the pluck of cithara strings, and there were dancers who moved like water between the reclining guests. Poets might be summoned to recite a new line, and a clever jester could turn a compliment into a quiet attack. These entertainments were comfortable as a well-worn robe, and yet they were also instruments, A compliment placed at the right moment could make a career. A careless hint could bring suspicion. Messalina mastered the choreography. She presided not as a mere ornament, but as a director who understood how the lights and sounds of a feast could be tuned to inspire gratitude or dependency. To be invited to her table was to be seen. To be favoured there might mean offices, land, or the whisper of an appointment. But Rome lived on rumour as much as it lived on bread. The city loved stories and was quick to turn small gestures into epics. Baths became confessionals. Someone unguarded would find their words travelling from tepid water to cobbled street. A servant carrying a folded note might deliver a request or a secret. A freedman lingering near the emperor might overhear a sentence that later transformed into an accusation. The market sellers, the barbers, the bathhouse gossips, all had ears. All had ears. The more extravagant the feast or the more visible the empress's favour, the more eyes searched for scandal. In Rome, a reputation could be built as easily as it could be torn down. Lovers, then, were not simply private companions. An intimate could be an ally, a rival maker, a liability. Ancient writers record many names and assign Messalina a litany of lovers, some transient, some elevated, some useful as pawns. We must tread gently here. The chroniclers who preserved these tales often delighted in excess, and their stories could be sharpened to scandal by those who wanted to moralise or to settle scores. Still, the pattern holds true. Messalina's circle included men whose fortunes rose when they pleased her and fell when she tired of them. Each liaison had the potential to rearrange alliances at court or to create jealousies that simmered into plots. One truth about affairs in the imperial household was blunt and practical. Intimacy with the Empress could be a shortcut to power. A lover might be recommended for a provincial command, whispered into a bureaucratic post, or given the indirect benefit of a lucrative contract act. The emperor, trusting his wife, often accepted her recommendations as natural household business. To the ambitious, therefore, the empress's favour was a prize. To her enemies it was a threat. And so lovers became instruments, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, in a game that blurred feeling and calculation. Messalina knew how to use these instruments, or, so the historians say, and in doing so she tightened a web of influence that made her both effective and exposed. Outside the palace, villas and haughty pleasure gardens offered softer theatres for desire. The Roman elite loved to slip away to Baiae, that famed resort on the Bay of Naples where hot springs steamed and the wealthy allowed themselves languor. They cultivated private gardens with shaded pergolas, fountains that sang at irregular hours, grottos tiled with shells, and peristyles framed with marble statues whose eyes seemed always to watch. In such places the social rules relaxed. Men and women could enjoy music and bathing, wine and conversation, away from the scrutinizing crowds of the city. The haughty around Rome, the haughty of Mixenas, the gardens of other grandees, were designed for privacy as much as for luxury. Terraces that dropped to pools, corridors painted with scenes of Arcadia, rooms scented with oils pressed from distant trees. It is easy to imagine Messalina among such settings, a figure moving through shade and light, the cool water reflecting her image as she considered who might be useful and who might be dangerous. Villas gave the elite a sense of detachment. The laws felt far away, the public eye dimmed. That detachment could breed confidence, and confidence could become carelessness. Many tales recount extravagant scenes at Baiae and similar retreats, where excesses unfolded and where, sometimes, the seeds of later disaster were planted. Whether Messalina habitually retreated to these places or simply used them when it suited her, the point is that such spaces allowed private choices whose consequences might later be public. Around these private pleasures swirled the machinery of patronage and influence, a latticework of freedmen, clients and senators. Claudius's reliance on trusted freedmen, men who had risen from slavery to hold enormous power in the palace, complicated the picture. Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, these names belonged to men who managed petitions, finances and the flow of information. They were indispensable and resented in equal measure. To the old aristocracy, their ascendancy was an affront. To the emperor, their competence was a relief. Messalina navigated among them, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. Freedmen could be friends and dangerous rivals, and for an empress whose strength derived from the emperor's trust, their favour or enmity mattered far more than public opinion alone. Power games in Rome had a soft, almost polite veneer. A senatorial career advanced through recommendation rather than overt command. An appointment could be won by the right word whispered at a banquet, by the discreet presentation of a precious bowl, by a marriage arranged between families. Façade. Messalina's talents lay in such small arts, arranging dowries, introducing suitors, praising a man's modesty at the right hour. These acts, though domestic in appearance, were political. The emperor's hand was guided not only by reports and laws, but by those who stood closest to him. To influence the empress was often the most efficient route to influence the emperor. Yet every move in this polished game risked retribution. Delators, professional accusers and informers, prowled the edges of power, ready to bring charges of treason or immorality when it suited them. A favour given today could be turned against its giver tomorrow. In such an environment, trust was both currency and liability. Messalina's rise would therefore be watched by those who stood to lose by it. Enemies cultivated patience and waited for a misstep, a lover's public arrogance, an appointment too brazen, a rumour persistent enough to coalesce into accusation. Rome's culture could transform private vice into public crime, and it often did. So the palace hummed with soft activity. Banquets that were tests of loyalty, gardens that were rehearsals for influence, villas that hosted both pleasure and conspiracy, and an invisible net of clients and freedmen that held the empire together. Messalina moved within this world like a conductor who loved the music and also knew its dangers. Her successes made friends, her favours bought support, and her boldness made enemies. The more adept she became at weaving advantage, the more attention she attracted from those who preferred the old order of senatorial privilege. At the close of many nights, when the lamps were guttering and the fountains had cooled, the palace returned to its private breathing. Children slept, guards kept their slow watch, a few notes of a lyre vanished into the hush, but the echo of the day's small acts, a favour granted, a whispered insult, a song half remembered, persisted. In the quiet hours, the seeds of future storms sometimes fell into fertile ground. Messalina's world was rich and intoxicating. It was also perilous. She had learned to play the games of power with an elegance that charmed her allies and enraged her opponents. And as her influence spread, the tensions around her hardened like frost on a garden's leaves, fragile and sharp. Sooner or later, those tensions would find a focal point. A marriage contracted in secrecy, an alliance assumed, a lover elevated beyond discretion. Such a moment was not far off. In the soft corridors of the Palatine, behind curtains and under the watch of lantern light, choices were being made that would not remain private for long. The empire's appetite for story, for drama, for scandal, would ensure that what began in shadow might end in the harsh glare of public judgment. We leave the garden for now, its fountains whispering into the dark, its marble statues patient as ever. The next turn of the tale will bring the world's attention to a single audacious act, an act that would test the loyalty of an emperor, the cunning of his advisors, and the limits of an empress's power. For now, let us breathe with the palace slow and measured, and listen as the night holds its stories close. The palace of Rome was a world unto itself, but it never stood apart from the wider city. Rumour bridged every marble wall, and in the marketplaces, bathhouses, and crowded tenements of the Suburra, the name of Messalina carried weight. To some she was adored. The young, beautiful empress who had given the emperor children, who seemed to secure the dynasty with Britannicus, a boy many Romans imagined would one day inherit the empire. To others she was feared, a shadowy figure who could determine careers with a nod or ruin reputations with a whisper. And to still others, she was nothing more than a story, a tale to be retold with laughter or scorn over cups of cheap wine. Ordinary Romans loved such tales. The city had always thrived on gossip, and the imperial household provided an endless supply. Senators, with their heavy dignity and solemn speeches, seemed distant and aloof. The emperor himself was rarely glimpsed by the common eye. But the empress, young, vivid, and rumoured to live a life of endless luxury, became a figure of fascination. A woman glimpsed in a chariot procession, her jewels flashing in the sun, could later be imagined as the star of more secret dramas. It mattered little whether the rumours were true. What mattered was that they gave the city something to whisper about, a story that made power human and fallible. Yet behind the chatter stood Messalina's role as wife and mother, a role more serious than scandal. Britannicus, the little boy with imperial blood in his veins, was her most precious legacy. His birth had secured Claudius's dynasty in ways no freedman or senator could equal. With Octavia, their daughter, Messalina also held the threads of future alliances. Noble families looked to her with eager calculation, hoping their sons might one day wed into the emperor's household. Every time she appeared with her children, Messalina embodied the promise of continuity, of Rome's stability. In this, she was more than rumour or pleasure. She was a living symbol of the empire's future. Still, the contrast between the public ideal and the private whispers created tension. Messalina could be praised in the Senate as the emperor's devoted partner one day and mocked in taverns as insatiable the next. Such contradictions were not unusual in Rome, where women of prominence had always attracted both admiration and envy. But the dangerous edge of rumour was that it could be sharpened into weaponry. Accusations of immorality were not just idle chatter. They could be used in trials, in Senate debates, in political manoeuvres that threatened life and fortune. A woman might be adored in the morning and accused of treason by evening. In these years, however, Messalina stood untouchable. Claudius's devotion remained steadfast, and his trust in her was profound. He was a man who often seemed hesitant, gentle, absorbed in his books and his administrative reforms, and he leaned on his wife as a companion who appeared strong where he was uncertain. As long as his trust endured, no whisper could shake her. And so Messalina lived within the paradox of Roman power, vulnerable in principle, yet invincible in practice. But seeds of unease were already sown. Each lover whispered about in corridors, each senator who felt slighted, each freedman who feared her reach. All of these small tensions formed a tapestry of discontent. Rome did not forgive extravagance easily, especially in women. The same stories that delighted the gossip mongers also hardened the resolve of her enemies. They would wait and they would watch for the moment when rumour could be transformed into proof. For now, though, the city dreamed under the gentle rule of Claudius, and Messalina moved as a star within it. Her gardens echoed with laughter, her banquets glowed with music, her children played beneath the watch of nurses, and her name floated across Rome like a perfume both sweet and intoxicating. To close one's eyes was to imagine the fountains, the lamplight, the marble halls where she reigned in youth and beauty. The empire itself seemed lulled, as though time had slowed. Claudius continued his reforms, steady but unremarkable. Senators debated without daring to challenge too boldly. Freedmen carried out their tasks with efficiency, their influence growing. And Messalina, bright, dangerous, adored and envied, wove her web more tightly with each passing season. The night settled over Rome like a heavy cloak. Fires glowed in the taverns, the Tiber moved with its endless murmur, and in the palace the fountains sang to the stars. Messalina, empress and mother, woman and myth, drifted into the heart of history. Her story, still in its season of ascent, had not yet touched its shadows. But shadows waited, as they always did, beyond the reach of lamplight. Rome had always thrived on whispers, but whispers, when repeated often enough, grew teeth. In the early years of Claudius's reign, Messalina's power seemed effortless, her position secure. She was the young empress, mother of Britannicus and Octavia, mistress of the Palatine, admired for her beauty and feared for her influence. Yet Rome was a city that never forgot its appetite for spectacle, and the people who feasted on gossip waited for stories of downfall as hungrily as they once celebrated her rise. The palace, with its marble corridors and guarded doors, might have seemed a sanctuary. But even there, rumour seeped in like mist. Courtiers, freedmen, and senators each carried fragments of observation, a gesture at a banquet, a smile exchanged too warmly, a man who lingered too long in the gardens. Out of such fragments, stories were born. Some were exaggerations, some entirely invented, but each added weight to the image of Messalina as a woman who could not be contained by the role of empress alone. At first, such stories remained confined to the privileged circles of Rome's elite. They were traded over wine cups at late-night dinners, murmured in the warm air of the baths, chuckled about by senators who envied her influence but dared not oppose her openly. The empress, they said, is generous with her favours. Some meant political favours, others meant something more. And so the line blurred, as it so often did in Rome, between politics and desire, between reality and invention. Messalina was young, beautiful, and powerful. Such a combination made her irresistible to the imagination. Ancient writers, centuries later, delighted in embellishing the image of her as a woman consumed by lust, who pursued lovers with reckless abandon. It is difficult to know how much of this was true, how much was hostile invention, and how much was the Roman tendency to see women of power as dangerous and excessive. Yet, even if the details were shaped by malice, the effect in her own time was real. The Empress became a figure both admired and feared, both envied and condemned. Messalina herself may have been aware of these whispers, and perhaps she did not care. To live as Empress was to live under constant scrutiny, and she had already learned that envy would never disappear. Still, her confidence grew bold. She did not shrink from pleasures, nor did she hesitate to use her position to elevate friends, lovers, or allies. Each gesture, each indulgence became another thread in a web that was both her strength and her danger. Among those who surrounded her was Gaius Silius, a senator of noble lineage, handsome, eloquent, and ambitious. His name would one day be forever entwined with hers, but in these early moments he was simply one of many who entered her orbit. The details of how their connection began are lost to history. Was it a glance at a banquet? A whispered conversation in the gardens? Or perhaps a deliberate choice by Messalina, who recognized in Silius not only beauty but opportunity. What we know is that their relationship, whatever its beginnings, would grow into something extraordinary in its audacity. For Rome had seen imperial mistresses and secret liaisons before, but never an empress who dared to make her affair a rival to her marriage itself. Before that climax, however, there was a slow unfolding. Messalina continued to host her banquets, to cultivate her gardens, to weave her alliances with the same serene grace. Claudius remained devoted, trusting, blind to the undercurrents around him. The freedmen advisors, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, watched with wary eyes, each calculating how much influence the Empress held and how far her ambitions might stretch. And Rome itself, ever restless, leaned closer to the story, as though waiting for the curtain to rise on a drama it suspected. The city had an instinct for scandal. It could smell it before it bloomed. And now, in the hushed corridors of the Palatine, in the laughter of midnight banquets, the Empress and the Senator, if Rome were a stage, and in many ways it always was, then the meeting of Messalina and Gaius Silius was like the entrance of two actors whose roles would draw every eye. He was young, noble, strikingly handsome, with the posture of a man accustomed to admiration. She was the Empress, resplendent, commanding, and dangerously aware of her own allure. Their connection did not begin with thunder. It began quietly, like so many things in Rome did. A glance held a fraction too long, a murmur exchanged amid the music of a banquet, a meeting that was half coincidence and half design. Yet, behind those small beginnings, an entire empire seemed to lean in, waiting for what would follow. Messalina, already whispered about for her indulgences, found in Silius a mirror of her own desires. He was not only beautiful, he was ambitious. He understood that to be close to the Empress was to step nearer to the levers of power, and Messalina, for her part, was not blind to the appeal of a lover who could be more than pleasure, who could be an ally in the dangerous currents of court politics. Their romance unfolded in the guarded spaces of the Palatine, in the shaded corners of gardens, in villas just outside the city where prying eyes were easier to evade. Ancient writers would later depict it as a storm of passion, Messalina unable to resist her appetite, Silius drawn into her orbit as though by a spell. Yet beneath the surface of desire, there was strategy. Each saw in the other not only a body to be desired, but a means to grasp at something larger. For Messalina, Silius was escape. Claudius, though kind, was older, cautious, easily swayed by advisors. With Silius, there was fire, a sense of youth, vitality, the thrill of breaking boundaries. For Silius, Messalina was the key to a world that no senator alone could unlock. He had wealth, he had lineage, but what he craved was influence, and through the Empress, influence seemed within reach. Their affair did not remain secret for long. In Rome, nothing ever did, servants whispered. Courtiers noticed the way Messalina lingered when Silius entered a room, the way his gaze sought hers with the boldness of a man who no longer cared to hide. The freedmen advisors heard rumours and weighed the danger. Yet for a time, the Empress's position was strong enough, Claudius's blindness deep enough, that the whispers remained only whispers. But what made this affair different, what made it scandalous even by Roman standards, was not merely the romance, it was the ambition woven into it. Messalina and Silius began to imagine possibilities beyond dalliance. They dreamed of power, of what might be achieved if Claudius were no longer in the way. Some ancient sources claim that Messalina even discussed marriage with Silius while Claudius still lived, an audacity that stunned Rome when the rumours spread. Whether those tales are exaggeration or not, one thing is certain. This was not a simple love affair. It was a partnership that threatened to shake the foundations of the empire. And yet, in the dreamy haze of those first encounters, it may not have felt like treason. To Messalina, it might have felt like freedom, to Silius like destiny. In the soft glow of lamplight, in the hidden laughter of midnight feasts, they may have believed themselves untouchable, as though Rome itself would bend to their will. But Rome does not forget. Rome does not forgive. Rome does not forgive. And every secret, however sweet in the moment, leaves a trace for others to follow. Whispers in the wind, Rome had always thrived on rumour, and rumour had always thrived on Rome. In the taverns along the Subura, in the shaded halls of the baths, in the murmurs exchanged at the Senate, stories spread faster than chariots on the circus track. And now the city had found a tale it could not resist, the Empress and the Senator. At first, it was no more than a whisper. Messalina is fond of Silius, whispered behind raised cups. Then it became a smirk, a knowing glance, a joke shared at dinner tables. Within weeks it grew teeth. Messalina dines with him when Claudius is away. Messalina visits his villa. Soon, rumour was no longer content with suggestion. It began to paint vivid pictures, the Empress slipping through secret doors, Silius walking boldly through the Palatine gardens, the two exchanging gifts too rich to be innocent. In truth, much of this was exaggeration, embroidered by idle tongues. But exaggeration in Rome was never harmless. Each rumour added weight, building a narrative of scandal that even silence could not smother. For those who envied Messalina, the rumours were weapons. For those who feared her, they were warnings, and for those who adored spectacle, they were a feast. The most dangerous rumour, however, was not of kisses or trysts, but of marriage. Ancient writers claimed that Messalina and Silius, drunk on passion and ambition, dared to plan a union that defied all reason. Some even said they staged a wedding with guests, sacrifices and feasting, while Claudius still wore the imperial crown. Whether this was literal or symbolic, no one can say with certainty. Perhaps it was a ritual, enacted in private, a gesture of commitment sealed with reckless bravado. Perhaps it was the invention of hostile chroniclers, eager to paint Messalina as the very embodiment of excess. Yet in Rome, perception mattered more than fact. The very idea that the Empress could dream of marrying another while her husband lived was scandal enough. To allies, it was a terrifying sign that Messalina had grown untouchable. To enemies, it was a gift, proof that her ambition had overstepped itself, that she could be painted not merely as indulgent, but as treasonous. And to Claudius, who remained oblivious for now, it was a storm gathering silently beyond his sight. In the quiet of their villas, Messalina and Silius may have felt exhilarated. They were young, powerful, and adored. Why should they not imagine more? Messalina had long wielded power through Claudius. With Silius, perhaps she dreamed of wielding it directly. Perhaps she envisioned herself as Empress beside a man who was not mocked for stammering, not doubted for frailty, but admired for strength. Yet such dreams, however intoxicating, were perilous in a city that could destroy with whispers alone. For every step they took together, Rome's watchful eyes grew sharper. The freedmen advisers began to hear reports too consistent to ignore. Senators, always eager for survival, quietly chose sides. And in the shadows, envy sharpened itself into blades. Messalina may have thought herself safe. After all, Claudius adored her. Britannicus and Octavia tied her to the dynasty, and her influence in the palace seemed unshakable. But in truth, every rumour was a crack in the marble. And cracks in time split palaces apart. The Empress in her own mirror to the world, Messalina was the Empress, resplendent, untouchable, a figure painted in marble and gold. But behind the polished façade, in the quiet of her chambers when torches burned low and the palace hushed, she was a woman who asked herself questions that no one else dared to voice. Why, she wondered, should she live bound to Claudius alone? He was kind, yes, but dull. Loyal, yes, but timid. Loyal, yes, but timid. His stammering words, his hesitant manner, they belonged to a man who stumbled into power, not one who commanded it. Messalina respected him as the father of her children, as the emperor fate had given her. But love was something different. With Silius, she felt alive. His youth, his beauty, his daring, it awakened something in her that court protocol could never satisfy. The warmth of his gaze, the confidence of his stride, the way he looked at her not as an empress to be flattered, but as a woman to be desired. These things melted the marble mask she wore each day. Was it wrong? Perhaps. But Rome itself was a city that lived in contradictions. Senators preached virtue while taking bribes in secret. Matrons spun wool in public but whispered scandals in private. Even the gods, immortal and divine, were known in myths to chase desires shamelessly. If Jupiter himself could claim any lover he wished, why should Messalina, Empress of Rome, be judged more harshly than the gods? Besides, power itself was a lonely weight. Every banquet, every decree, every glance in the Senate reminded her that eyes watched her constantly, searching for flaws, for weakness, for scandal. To be always guarded, always perfect, was to suffocate slowly. With Silius, she could breathe. He gave her laughter when the court gave her formality. He gave her passion when the palace gave her routine. And ambition, yes, ambition whispered too. In the darkest moments of the night, when she dared to dream beyond the safety of caution, she wondered, why should she always reign through Claudius? Why should power always be mediated by men who underestimated her, resented her, or feared her? Silius was strong, admired, and capable. If he were emperor beside her, if she were no longer merely the consort but the sovereign partner, then perhaps she could shape Rome in ways Claudius never dared. These thoughts frightened her at times, yet they thrilled her more. In the mirror, she would study her reflection, the curve of her face, the dark shine of her hair, the youth that still clung to her features. She told herself she was not only beautiful but destined. How could destiny be denied, even if the path to it was dangerous? So she justified. What others might call betrayal, she called freedom. What others whispered as scandal, she felt as truth. In her heart, she told herself that she was not simply indulging in passion. She was seizing the life she deserved. And yet, somewhere beneath those justifications, a small unease lingered. For every time she laughed with Silius, she knew servants saw. Every gift exchanged left a trace. Every stolen hour etched another crack in the mask of safety. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she was too secure, too beloved, too essential to fall. But Rome is not kind to those who believe themselves invincible. And though she could not hear it yet, the city that once whispered her beauty was beginning to whisper something else, her downfall. The blind emperor and the watchful freedman Claudius by nature was not a man of suspicion. He had never been groomed to rule. Power had fallen upon him like an accident. Even as emperor, he often preferred his books, his studies, his quiet dinners to the games of politics that swirled endlessly around him. Where others saw conspiracy, Claudius tended to see coincidence. Where others whispered betrayal, Claudius heard only loyalty. In this, he was both endearing and dangerous. His kindness made him approachable, almost human, in a role that demanded godlike distance. But his trust made him vulnerable, a man who often could not see the dagger until it was at his throat. And when it came to Messalina, his blindness was nearly absolute. He adored her. She was young, radiant, the mother of his children. To Claudius, she was not a threat but a blessing, the anchor that gave him legitimacy in the eyes of Rome. He saw her smiles not as masks, but as truth. He heard whispers of her beauty and took them as proof of his fortune. Never once did he imagine that her laughter might not be his alone, but others in the palace did not share his innocence. The freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, were men who had risen from slavery to become the emperor's most trusted advisors. Each was shrewd, each was ambitious, and each understood that survival in the palace depended on seeing what the emperor did not. Narcissus, sharp-tongued and calculating, was the first to speak of danger. He heard the rumours of Messalina's escapades and did not dismiss them as idle gossip. "Where there is so much smoke," he muttered, "there must be fire." Pallas, quieter but no less shrewd, considered the implications. He had watched the senators, how their eyes flickered when Silius's name was mentioned, how their voices tightened when they spoke of the Empress. These were not the signs of harmless scandal. This was politics, ambition, cloaked in passion. Icrus Silius grows bold, he warned. He may not stop at her chambers. He may set his eyes on the throne. Callistus, ever cautious, was reluctant to press too hard. He knew Claudius's devotion to Messalina and feared the emperor's anger if their suspicions proved unfounded. But even he admitted unease. An empress who forgets discretion, he said carefully, is an empress who invites disaster. Together they formed a triangle of watchfulness around Claudius, each trying in his own way to pierce the emperor's blindness. Yet Claudius resisted. When Narcissus hinted that Messalina's affections were straying, Claudius waved it off with a weary smile. When Pallas suggested that Silius might harbour dangerous ambitions, Claudius frowned but said nothing. Messalina is devoted, he insisted. She has given me children. She has stood by me. To doubt her was, for Claudius, to doubt his own judgment, his own fortune, and that he could not bear. So the freedmen waited. They sharpened their ears to every whisper, their eyes to every gesture, their instincts to every rumour that floated through Rome. They knew that if Messalina continued unchecked, the danger would grow. But they also knew that the moment to act had not yet come. To strike too soon would mean Claudius's wrath, and perhaps their own downfall. For now they watched, they calculated. They stored each rumour like an arrow in a quiver, waiting for the moment when the emperor would finally be forced to see. And in the meantime, Messalina's confidence swelled. She laughed, she feasted, she whispered with Silius in hidden corners. She believed herself safe because Claudius remained blind. But the freedman saw what she could not, that blindness was not eternal. One day soon, Claudius would be made to look. And when he did, the entire empire would feel the tremor. Chapter 5. Rome in the grip of scandal. Rome was a city that never slept. Yet in the year when Messalina's passions grew bolder, it seemed as though the very stones of the forum whispered of her. By day the markets bustled, slaves carried baskets, senators moved in processions toward the curia. By night, laughter and music floated from villas where wine never ceased to pour. But beneath the rhythms of ordinary life there was an unshakable sense that something dangerous was stirring in the heart of the empire. The rumours of the Empress and Gaius Silius no longer belonged to the private banquets of the elite. They had spilled into the streets, where fruit sellers and lamp makers repeated them as though they were common tales. Children whispered songs mocking Claudius's blindness. Drunken men in taverns made bold jests that even the guards could not silence. The Empress had become a character in the theatre of the people, both admired and ridiculed, envied and condemned. For Rome, scandal was entertainment, but it was also prophecy. Citizens had seen dynasties rise and fall on less. They remembered Caligula's madness, the extravagances of emperors past. They knew that when desire overtook discipline, the gods grew restless and the state trembled. In Messalina, they saw not only a woman of passion, but the symbol of an empire swaying between strength and decay. In the palace, the tension thickened. Claudius still clung to his trust, but his freedmen no longer hid their unease. Narcissus sharpened his words, urging vigilance. Pallas studied alliances, noting which senators seemed to drift towards Silius's orbit. Callistus, wary, pressed for caution, but admitted that silence was becoming impossible. Meanwhile, Messalina herself seemed untouched by fear. Surrounded by gardens, music and lovers, she lived as though her pleasures were eternal, as though the city itself bent to her will. To her the whispers were background noise, the harmless envy of lesser souls. She did not yet see how swiftly envy could become accusation, and accusation become fate. The affair with Silius had crossed from indulgence into audacity. They no longer hid as carefully. They exchanged gifts openly. They dined in each other's company with barely a veil of discretion. Some say Messalina even insisted that senators bow to Silius as though he were already more than a lover, as though he were a partner in rule. Whether fact or exaggeration, such tales spread like fire in dry grass, and in Rome, once fire caught, it was nearly impossible to quench. The city waited breath-held for the spark that would set everything aflame. Desire and ambition entwined the gardens of the Palatine had never looked more radiant than in those months. Roses bloomed even out of season, fountains spilled cool water into marble basins, and musicians played soft notes, while dancers moved like shadows across the courtyards. Messalina presided over it all with the serenity of a goddess, as though the empire itself existed to decorate her pleasures. Banquets became more lavish than ever. Tables bent beneath the weight of fruits brought from distant provinces, wines aged in amphorae older than the guests who drank them, rare delicacies from Africa and the East. The air was thick with incense, heavy with perfume, filled with laughter that often turned to whispers behind raised hands. For Messalina, extravagance was not indulgence alone. It was display, a demonstration that she was untouchable, that her pleasures could stretch as wide as the empire itself. Yet amid the music and the feasting, Silius was not content merely to be a lover. He was a senator, a man of lineage and ambition, and though he indulged in the Empress's luxuries with the same appetite, his mind moved towards something larger. To him, each banquet was more than celebration, it was recruitment. Each guest drawn into their circle was a potential ally, each toast to their happiness a quiet pledge of support. Whispers began to circulate of conversations held in hushed tones, senators frustrated with Claudius's reliance on freedmen, nobles weary of an emperor mocked as weak, men who saw in Silius the vigour and dignity Rome longed for. To them the affair was more than scandal, it was opportunity. And Messalina, in her vanity, may have encouraged it. Perhaps she imagined herself not merely as empress beside a hesitant husband, but as the consort of a ruler bold enough to match her own hunger. Perhaps she saw in Silius the partner who would let her reign not from the shadows, but in the open, her power undisguised. Some accounts even claim that Silius, driven by ambition, urged her to marry him openly, arguing that Claudius's position was fragile and that the Senate might accept a new union if presented with confidence. Whether this was truth or hostile exaggeration, the very existence of such a rumour reveals how audacious their relationship had become. For Rome, indulgence was one thing, treason another, and the line between them was now blurring. While Messalina delighted in luxury, convinced that her beauty and charm shielded her from consequence, Silius was weaving dreams of empire. He watched the freedmen with wary eyes, calculating how long Claudius's blindness could endure. He gauged which senators might join his cause, which generals might be persuaded. Every glance he exchanged with Messalina in public carried not only desire but the unspoken question, how far will we go? And yet, in the soft glow of lamplight, among the roses and music, it must have felt intoxicating. To them, it was as though the empire had already bent to their will. They lived as if tomorrow could never come, as if Rome itself would always indulge their daring. But tomorrow always comes. And in Rome, it often comes with iron and blood. Whispers in the streets, Rome was a city that thrived on stories. Markets sold grain, olives and wine, but gossip was its truest currency. In the crowded Subura district, bakers leaned from their shops to trade rumours with passing customers, while water sellers in the forum whispered news with every ladle poured. At taverns thick with smoke and cheap wine, citizens repeated tales heard from a cousin's friend who worked in a senator's household, and in these days one name lingered on every tongue, Messalina. The common people had long known her as beautiful, indulgent, even generous at times. But generosity could not silence scandal. Whispers claimed she kept a contest among Rome's courtesans, proving she could outlast them all in pleasure. Others murmured that she sold her favours in disguise, as if the Empress herself desired to taste the freedom of vice. Whether these tales were truth or invention hardly mattered. Their retelling made them real. Satirists found endless inspiration. Street performers mimicked Claudius as a stammering fool, holding a puppet wife who slipped away to dance with another. Graffiti scratched on the walls of Rome carried crude jokes, mocking the emperor's blindness and the empress's appetites. The more daring playwrights wove veiled parodies into their comedies, careful to disguise their targets, just enough to avoid a charge of treason. Even children in the streets sang little rhymes, cruel in their simplicity, about the emperor cuckolded and Rome ruled by a woman's desire. For the senatorial class, such rumours carried darker weight. To them, Messalina was not merely indulgent, she was dangerous. Her alliances with powerful men, her whispered promises, her ability to make or break careers, all this suggested she was shaping policy as much as pleasure. With Silius at her side, the whispers became bolder. Perhaps they were not content to rule in shadows, perhaps they dreamed of something more. And yet, while laughter echoed in the theatres and gossip spread like fire through the markets, the palace seemed oblivious, or rather, Claudius seemed oblivious. His freedmen, however, were not. Shadows in the palace, while the streets of Rome laughed at crude jokes and whispered ballads of betrayal. Another theatre of action was unfolding within the marble walls of the Palatine. Here, not actors and musicians but freedmen and secretaries held the stage, men who, though born slaves, now carried inkwells and seals that could command armies. Among them, 3 names were spoken with both fear and envy: Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus. They were the emperor's shadows, his unseen strength, and to many senators, his greatest weakness. Yet in these uncertain days they proved sharper-eyed than the Senate itself. It was Narcissus, the secretary for petitions, who first gathered the threads. His sharp ears caught reports from informers. Messalina hosting senators in her gardens, gifts passing hands too freely, Silius's presence too frequent, too comfortable. Narcissus had survived court life long enough to know that pleasure could hide plots and laughter could cloak ambition. He filed each whisper away, like small stones in a pouch, waiting until the weight was undeniable. Pallas, keeper of the treasury, noticed patterns as well. Money was flowing strangely, estates changing hands, debts forgiven, dowries arranged with unusual haste. Rome's finances always carried secrets, but this smelled not of private indulgence alone. It hinted at preparation, as though allies were being purchased, as though a new household was being readied for rule. And Callistus, the master of correspondence, saw the shift in tone. Letters addressed to Claudius grew more formal, less respectful, as if some men already calculated his days were numbered. Couriers carried messages to Silius with alarming frequency. The handwriting of power, Callistus knew, was tilting elsewhere. Individually, these signs could be dismissed. You'd be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern too dangerous to ignore. So the freedmen began to meet in quiet corners, not in grand chambers but in shadowed porticos, among stacks of documents, behind the curtains of the emperor's office. They spoke softly, always mindful of listening ears. Their loyalty to Claudius was not born of love alone, but of necessity. Without him, they were nothing. If Silius and Messalina truly dreamed of power, the freedmen's own lives would be the first to end. Narcissus argued for swift action, to confront the emperor, to expose Messalina's treachery before it spread further. Pallas counselled caution, fearing that Claudius's indecision might leave them exposed. Callistus, ever the mediator, urged patience, but even he admitted that silence could be fatal. At last they agreed. The emperor must be shown the truth gently but firmly. Yet how to awaken a man so reluctant to see? Claudius's heart was bound to Messalina, blinded by her beauty, dulled by habit. To accuse her was to risk his wrath, or worse, his disbelief. Still, the freedmen began preparing. Narcissus collected testimonies. Pallas tracked suspicious transactions. Callistus drafted memoranda that, with the right timing, could be slipped before Claudius's eyes. Quietly, discreetly, they laid their groundwork. For in the palace of Rome, danger did not come only from barbarians at the frontier or riots in the forum. It came from within, from smiles that hid daggers, from whispers that grew into storms. And in those days the storm was gathering fast. Chapter 6. The gathering storm Rome, in those early autumn days, seemed unchanged to the casual eye. The markets still bustled, the theatres still echoed with laughter, the temples smoked with incense, yet beneath this ordinary surface an unease had begun to spread. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the marble walls of the Palatine carried secrets too heavy to hold. Messalina, however, remained radiant. To her, the world was still a festival. Each evening she arranged banquets more splendid than the last. Silken couches spread in her gardens, rare delicacies piled high, musicians playing until dawn. Senators reclined at her side, drinking deeply, listening to her laughter, feeling themselves part of something daring and new. Silius was always near, not in the shadows now, but proudly beside her, as though he already wore the invisible crown of power. It was said that they whispered of marriage. Some swore that they spoke of it openly. Whether the plan was fantasy or reckless intention, the rumour alone was like a spark in dry grass. Marriage while Claudius still lived, it was more than scandal. It was treason wrapped in silk. Meanwhile Claudius moved through his days unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see. He busied himself with minor trials, with public works, with the small details that filled his hours. He trusted that his household was loyal, that his wife was dutiful, that his world was stable. He moved slowly, carefully, never suspecting that the ground beneath him had already begun to crack. But in the shadows, his freedmen worked tirelessly. Narcissus sharpened his case, gathering testimony from servants and spies. Pallas traced money and favours, binding together the evidence of conspiracy. Callistus polished the words with which the truth might finally be laid before the emperor. The storm was not yet visible, but its winds had begun to stir. The gardens of Messalina still glowed with torchlight, yet beyond the hedges, in the silent corners of the palace, whispers gathered like thunderclouds. It was the stillness before lightning. The night of reckless union, it was a strange night, even by the measure of Rome's endless banquets. The lamps in Messalina's gardens burned brighter than usual, the air thick with incense, the music more fevered. Guests arrived in hushed anticipation, as though invited not to a feast, but to a spectacle few could believe until they saw it. At the centre of it all stood Messalina, veiled in white silk, her jewels gleaming like stars caught in fabric. Beside her was Silius, tall and proud, clothed not in secrecy but in the solemn dignity of a bridegroom. Some whispered nervously, others laughed as though it were a jest too daring for words. Yet the forms were followed. The rites of marriage, the gestures, even the invocation of the gods. If it was parody, it was performed with unsettling seriousness. If it was fantasy, it was acted as though it were real. The very act blurred the line between theatre and treason. Messalina may have believed it was all hers to command. The power of her beauty, the loyalty of her circle, the weakness of her husband. In her mind, perhaps, Claudius was already irrelevant, a figure too feeble to resist, too blind to strike. To marry Silius in open defiance while the emperor still breathed was to declare that the empire itself bent to her will. For Silius, ambition burned hotter. He had courted senators with gifts and promises, and now, standing beside the empress in this shadowed ceremony, he tasted the nearness of ultimate power. He was no longer merely a lover. He was a partner in destiny. With Messalina at his side, he imagined himself poised to step into the purple. The guests, senators, equestrians, men of note, watched with conflicting hearts. Some trembled at the audacity, wondering whether they had stumbled into a crime disguised as revelry. Others, intoxicated by wine and music, convinced themselves they were witnessing the birth of a new era. Still others remained silent, calculating which side might prevail when dawn came. And so the vows were spoken, the union sealed not in secret but in the reckless blaze of torches, as though Rome itself was summoned to witness. But beyond the hedges, in the quiet corners of the Palatine, other eyes were watching. The freedmen's spies carried the news swiftly, breathless with disbelief. Within hours, Narcissus and his fellows would hold in their hands the proof they had awaited, proof so outrageous that even Claudius could no longer ignore it. For now, though, the night belonged to Messalina and Silius. They danced and drank as if the empire itself had already shifted, as if the marble halls and legions of Rome answered only to their call. Their laughter carried high into the night, echoing against the dark sky, bold enough to drown out the sound of thunder forming on the horizon. It was not a wedding of love, nor even of desire alone. It was a union of arrogance and ambition, a reckless play staged in the gardens of pleasure, and like all plays, it would end when the curtain fell. The city that whispered Rome was never silent. By dawn, the markets of the Forum were already humming, mule drivers shouting, women bargaining, boys darting between stalls. But on this morning, a different sound filled the air, not the clatter of commerce, but the low murmur of rumour. They say she wore a bridal veil, whispered a baker to his neighbour, flour dusting his tunic. And Silius stood at her side, proud as any bridegroom, the other replied, shaking his head as though trying to rid himself of the image. Of the image. At the taverns, men leaned across wooden tables, cups of cheap wine forgotten in their hands. It cannot be true. No woman would dare, not the Empress herself. But it was true. My cousin's friend was there. They drank to the union as though Claudius were already dead. The more the tale spread, the stranger it became. Some swore Messalina and Silius had already proclaimed themselves rulers in all but name. Others whispered of sacrifices offered to the gods, of senators pledging allegiance, of feasts that lasted till dawn, with vows spoken before the lares and penates. Each retelling embroidered the story further, but the heart of it remained. The Empress had married another man while her husband still wore the crown. Children in the streets turned it into rhyme, chanting crude verses that made passing elders scowl and cross themselves. Actors in the theatres slipped sly references into their comedies, drawing laughter from audiences who recognised the parody without a word spoken. Graffiti bloomed on walls overnight, depicting Claudius as a fool clutching an empty bed while his wife stood beside another. For the common people, the tale was half scandal, half entertainment. For the senators and equestrians, it was terror. They knew the weight of treason. They knew the sharp edge of imperial wrath. Those who had attended the wedding now trembled, wondering if their presence would be seen as complicity. Those who had refused felt no safer. For who could say which way fortune would turn? If Messalina and Silius seized power, neutrality would be punished as betrayal. Everywhere, laughter mingled with unease. Rome was a city used to excess, but this was beyond even its appetite for scandal. It was as if the city itself sensed that a great wheel was turning, that beneath the jokes and whispers lay the crack of thunder waiting to strike. Meanwhile, Claudius remained in the dark, still moving through his rituals of governance, still trusting in the illusions that surrounded him. But the city no longer shared that blindness. Rome was awake, buzzing, breathless, waiting to see whether the emperor would open his eyes, or whether the empress's bold gamble would indeed reshape the empire. The whisper had become a roar, and the roar could not be silenced. Awakening the emperor, the chamber was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across the scrolls piled high on the emperor's desk. Claudius sat bent over a document, lips moving softly as he traced each line with a finger. Clah. His world was one of words and details, a quiet rhythm of bureaucracy. Outside, Rome roared with whispers, but here, in the stillness of the palace, silence held him in its embrace. It was Narcissus who entered first, careful, almost reverent. Behind him came Pallas and Callistus, their faces grave, their voices hushed. Claudius looked up, blinking as though disturbed from a dream. "But my lords, what is it?" Another petition, another quarrel in the Senate. His voice was weary but expectant, ready for the small burdens that usually filled his day. But this was no ordinary petition. Narcissus exchanged a glance with the others, then stepped forward. He held a tablet in his hand. Not just words, but testimony, witness accounts, reports gathered in secret. His fingers tightened on it before he spoke. "Isa, it is about the Empress." Claudius's face softened immediately, almost fond. "Messalina, what of her? She is well." There was a pause, heavy, suffocating. Then Narcissus spoke the words like a knife lowered with infinite care. "As if married, she has taken Gaius Silius as her husband, while you still live." For a moment, silence. The words hung in the air like smoke. Unreal, impossible. Unreal, impossible. Claudius blinked, shook his head, almost smiled. "Married? You jest. This is some cruel rumour from the streets." He waved a hand as if brushing away a fly. "A fly. A Messalina is dutiful. She loves our children. She would not. She could not." Pallas stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "It is no rumour, Caesar. Witnesses were present. Senators attended. The rites were spoken, the veil worn, the vows exchanged." Claudius stared, his lips trembling. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as though anchoring himself against a sudden storm. No. You are deceived." Or they are deceived. Perhaps it was some jest, a play. Callistus laid another scroll upon the desk. "Here, my lord, testimony from your own servants, from men who saw with their eyes. This was no play. The emperor's breath came shallow, ragged." His mind, so used to sifting details of law and order, could not grasp this enormity. He saw his wife's face, smiling, laughing, gentle in the garden with their children. He saw Silius, bold, handsome, always too near but never threatening. And then the images blurred, twisted, fused into something unbearable. Messalina veiled, standing beside another, declaring herself another man's bride. Denial cracked, giving way to terror. Claudius felt the room tilt, as though the marble itself betrayed him. "If this is true," he whispered, voice hoarse, "then I am undone. The empire is undone. They will kill me. Replace me." Narcissus leaned closer, steady, sharp. "Or not if you act, Caesar. Not if you see the truth and seize it." Claudius looked at him with wide, drowning eyes, a man pulled from sleep into nightmare. For the first time, the freedmen saw him not as an emperor, nor as a scholar, but as a frightened old man, uncertain, bewildered, trembling. Yet within that fear, something else began to kindle. The faint glow of realization. Messalina had crossed the line. What had been indulgence, scandal, rumour, it was now treason, undeniable. Claudius pressed his trembling hands together, as though praying. His voice cracked but grew firmer. Show me everything. I must know." And so the freedman laid the evidence before him. Testimony, names, details of the ceremony, the senators who had witnessed, the soldiers who whispered. Piece by piece, the emperor's illusion shattered until nothing remained but the cold edge of truth. At last, Claudius leaned back, pale as marble, eyes hollow. He whispered one word, half a plea, half a curse. A Messalina, the storm had finally broken inside him. Chapter 6. The Emperor's Decision. The night outside had deepened. From the palace gardens came the faint rustle of wind through cypress trees, the distant call of a night bird. Within the emperor's chamber, however, the air was thick, unmoving, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Claudius sat frozen, the evidence spread before him like broken pieces of his life. His lips moved without sound, whispering fragments to himself, as though the words might rearrange into another meaning, something less cruel. But the pieces refused to change. Narcissus bent low, his voice a steady whisper. "Caesar, you must act. Every hour you hesitate, they strengthen. Silius has gathered senators already. They speak of a new household, a new princeps. If they strike first, all is lost." Claudius shivered. The image of Rome shifting away from him, his throne taken, his name erased, stabbed at him more sharply than betrayal itself. "But, Messalina," he murmured, his voice cracked like a child's, "she has borne me children. She has been Empress. How can I lift a hand against her? How can I lift a hand against her?" Pallas's answer was calm, but merciless. "If you do not, she will lift one against you. Already she has called herself another's wife. Already the city whispers that Claudius is old, weak, discarded. If you falter now, Caesar, you will not only lose her, you will lose Rome." Claudius closed his eyes. For a long while he was utterly still. The lamp flame flickered against his pale face, showing the tremor of his jaw, the trembling of his hands. Then a sound escaped him. A long, low exhale, not of peace but of surrender to necessity. He opened his eyes, and though they were rimmed with tears, something had hardened within them. The timidity had not vanished, but beneath it burned a dim iron ember. "Then she must be brought to me," he whispered. Narcissus exchanged a quick glance with Callistus, a silent spark of triumph. He pressed gently. "Caesar, there is danger in delay. If she is summoned, her allies may move to protect her, to stir the guard, to turn the Senate. No, my lord. It is safer if she is seized quietly, firmly, before word can spread." Claudius's lips trembled. "Seized by my order." "By your command," Narcissus said firmly, "and for the safety of Rome." For a moment, Claudius seemed to shrink again, as if the weight of such a command would crush him. But slowly he nodded. His hand, unsteady, reached for the stylus. He bent over the wax tablet and scratched his trembling order into its surface. The words were simple, cold, final. Messalina was to be taken. When he finished, the emperor sat back as though drained of all strength. His face was a mask of sorrow and confusion, but beneath it was the ghost of resolve. "Go," he whispered, not looking at them. "Do what must be done." The freedmen bowed low, their faces grave, though within them burned the satisfaction of steering the helm of empire. They withdrew, carrying the order that would decide the fate of an empress. Alone now, Claudius stared into the flickering lamp. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes that mocked him: a veiled bride, a rival's strong profile, the cold sneer of Rome itself. He whispered her name one last time, not as emperor, but as a broken husband. A Messalina. The flame guttered, then steadied. The decision had been made. Chapter 6. The Emperor's Decision. The night outside had deepened. From the palace gardens came the faint rustle of wind through cypress trees, the distant call of a night bird. Within the emperor's chamber, however, the air was thick, unmoving, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Claudius sat frozen, the evidence spread before him like broken pieces of his life. His lips moved without sound, whispering fragments to himself, as though the words might rearrange into another meaning, something less cruel. But the pieces refused to change. Narcissus bent low, his voice a steady whisper. "Caesar, you must act. Every hour you hesitate, they strengthen. Silius has gathered senators already. They speak of a new household, a new princeps. If they strike first, all is lost." Claudius shivered. The image of Rome shifting away from him, his throne taken, his name erased, stabbed at him more sharply than betrayal itself. "But, Messalina," he murmured, his voice cracked like a child's, "she has borne me children. She has been Empress. How can I lift a hand against her? How can I lift a hand against her?" Pallas's answer was calm, but merciless. "If you do not, she will lift one against you. Already she has called herself another's wife. Already the city whispers that Claudius is old, weak, discarded. If you falter now, Caesar, you will not only lose her, you will lose Rome." Claudius closed his eyes. For a long while he was utterly still. The lamp flame flickered against his pale face, showing the tremor of his jaw, the trembling of his hands. Then a sound escaped him. A long, low exhale, not of peace but of surrender to necessity. He opened his eyes, and though they were rimmed with tears, something had hardened within them. The timidity had not vanished, but beneath it burned a dim iron ember. "Then she must be brought to me," he whispered. Narcissus exchanged a quick glance with Callistus, a silent spark of triumph. He pressed gently. "Caesar, there is danger in delay. If she is summoned, her allies may move to protect her, to stir the guard, to turn the Senate. No, my lord. It is safer if she is seized quietly, firmly, before word can spread." Claudius's lips trembled. "Seized by my order." "By your command," Narcissus said firmly, "and for the safety of Rome." For a moment, Claudius seemed to shrink again, as if the weight of such a command would crush him. But slowly he nodded. His hand, unsteady, reached for the stylus. He bent over the wax tablet and scratched his trembling order into its surface. The words were simple, cold, final. Messalina was to be taken. When he finished, the emperor sat back as though drained of all strength. His face was a mask of sorrow and confusion, but beneath it was the ghost of resolve. "Go," he whispered, not looking at them. "Do what must be done." The freedmen bowed low, their faces grave, though within them burned the satisfaction of steering the helm of empire. They withdrew, carrying the order that would decide the fate of an empress. Alone now, Claudius stared into the flickering lamp. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes that mocked him, a veiled bride, a rival's strong profile, the cold sneer of Rome itself. He whispered her name one last time, not as emperor, but as a broken husband. A Messalina. The flame guttered, then steadied. The decision had been made. Chapter 7. The Fall of the Empress, Part A. The net closes night in Rome had grown heavy, as though the city itself anticipated a reckoning. The marble temples glowed faintly in moonlight, silent guardians over streets that twisted with whispers. For days the capital had hummed with rumour. By now the whispers were no longer gentle. They were sharp, dangerous, and aimed squarely at the woman who had called herself Empress. Messalina. In the shadows of the Palatine, Narcissus gathered with trusted soldiers of the Praetorian Guard. Their armour gleamed dully beneath cloaks, shields hidden, swords sheathed but ready. Every man knew the stakes. This was not a raid upon a common criminal, nor the arrest of a disgraced senator. This was the seizure of the emperor's wife, mother of his children, mistress of his household. To fail was unthinkable. To succeed was to stand on the knife edge of history. Narcissus, ever calculating, leaned toward the tribune in command. His voice was low, yet sharp as a blade. There must be no hesitation. She will attempt charm, she will attempt cheers, she will attempt promises, she will attempt promises. Ignore them all. Remember, she has already made herself another man's bride. That is treason, that is death. The tribune nodded, though sweat shone on his brow. Few dared move against one who had been Rome's most powerful woman. But Narcissus's authority was absolute, and behind him loomed the written order of Claudius himself. The detachment marched silently, their footsteps muffled against the paving stone. Past taverns where drunkards sang, past darkened insulae where the poor slept, past statues of gods whose stone eyes seemed to watch. Their destination lay just beyond the city's edge, Messalina's villa, where torches still burned despite the hour. Inside that villa, the Empress laughed. She reclined on soft cushions, wine cup in hand, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Beside her sat Gaius Silius, still glowing from the dangerous folly of their mock marriage. Guests lingered, a handful of reckless allies, poets and flatterers who thrived on scandal. The atmosphere was one of desperate festivity, as though by celebrating they might drown out the tide of danger. Messalina raised her cup high, her voice still rich with confidence. "Claudius is a fool, he will forgive me. He always does. He fears scandal more than he fears me. And by morning this marriage will be nothing but another rumour lost in Rome's endless gossip." Silius forced a smile, though unease shadowed his handsome face. He had heard the whispers, soldiers moving, freedmen whispering in corners. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Valeria, we cannot trust that he will forgive. The emperor is no longer alone. Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, they hate you, and they are patient. Tonight may be our last chance to act first." Messalina waved a dismissive hand, laughter spilling again. "A Narcissus, a freedman with delusions. He dares nothing without Claudius, and Claudius dares nothing without me. She drank deeply, savouring the wine as though it were a shield. At that very moment, the villa gates groaned. Iron clashed. A torch flared. The Praetorian Guard had arrived. The sudden sound jolted the guests. Laughter broke into silence, then into whispers of panic. Silius shot to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword that was not there. Messalina froze, cup trembling in her grasp, her confident mask beginning to crack. Through the courtyard poured armoured men, shields glinting, spears raised. At their head strode Narcissus, his expression hard, merciless. He looked not at Silius, not at the startled guests, but at her. "A Valeria Messalina," he said, voice carrying over the frightened murmurs. "By command of the Emperor, you are seized." Her eyes widened. For a heartbeat, she seemed unable to speak. Then, like a cornered tigress, she found her voice, sharp and imperious. "You dare," she cried, rising with fury. "I am the wife of Claudius Caesar, mother of his children, Augusta of Rome. You are nothing but slaves and mercenaries. Do you think he will forgive this insult?" Narcissus did not flinch. "It is no insult, but obedience. The Emperor knows of your betrayal. He knows of your betrayal. He knows of your so-called marriage. He has signed the order himself." The words struck like a blade. Around her, the guests began to slip away, some vanishing into darkened corridors, others attempting to flee through side doors. Loyalty dissolved like mist in sunlight. Silius remained, though his face had gone pale. He stepped forward, his voice steady, though heavy with doom. "If the Emperor commands it, then let me face him. I am no coward. Take me, and let Rome judge if I am guilty." The tribune signalled, and 2 guards seized Silius by the arms. He did not resist, though his eyes lingered once on Messalina's face, a mixture of regret, desire, and resignation. Then he was dragged into the night. Messalina's breath came fast. Her mind, so often quick with schemes, raced desperately. She turned from the soldiers to Narcissus, softening her tone, pouring every ounce of charm into her words. "Narcissus, you know me. You know Claudius loves me still. If you let me speak to him, he will forgive. He will reward you beyond imagining. Think, do you want to be remembered as the freedman who betrayed his Empress, or the one who saved her?" For a flicker, silence held. But Narcissus had long steeled himself against her. "Against her? You mistake me," he said coldly. "I am not your servant. I am Rome's." With a gesture, he ordered the guards. They stepped forward, binding her wrists with rough cord. She gasped, not from pain, but from disbelief. Never before had hands dared touch her with anything but reverence. As they led her from the villa, the torches illuminated her face, pale, furious, and streaked with sudden tears. The woman who had ruled Rome's palace as seductress and queen now walked under guard, her silk hem trailing in the dust. The streets, once hers to command, now watched in silence as she passed. Windows cracked open, whispers hissed like serpents, and unseen eyes drank in the fall of an empress. For Messalina, the night had turned from feast to nightmare, and yet, somewhere deep within her, hope still smouldered. Claudius had forgiven before. Perhaps he would again. If she could only reach him, look into his weary eyes, remind him of her children, her place by his side. Perhaps this was not the end. But Narcissus knew otherwise. The net had closed. Part be waiting for mercy. Meeting fate, the procession through Rome was not triumphant, yet it was no less dramatic than a triumphal parade. Torches lit the narrow streets, their flicker catching glimpses of Messalina's face, proud yet streaked with tears, haughty yet trembling beneath the cords that bound her wrists. The guards kept their silence, boots striking rhythm against the stones. Narcissus rode near, his gaze fixed ahead, refusing her pleas. Behind them, stragglers whispered. Servants craned their necks, women clutched their shawls and murmured, "Is it true? The Empress arrested?" The story would spread faster than any runner, carried in gasps and mutters through every alley of the city. By the time they reached the Praetorian camp, Rome already knew Messalina, Augusta, had fallen. She was confined not in a dungeon, for that would have been too base for one of her rank, but in a guarded villa near the gardens of Lucullus. A bitter irony. She, who had once presided over those very gardens with luxury and abandon, now sat within them as a prisoner, her fate balanced on a blade of imperial whim. Messalina's mind raced. She refused to believe it was over. Claudius was weak, tender-hearted. He had forgiven her countless affairs, turned blind eyes to rumours, chosen domestic quiet over confrontation. Yes, she had gone too far this time perhaps, but surely the Emperor would not destroy the mother of his son, the woman who had shared his bed for years. She summoned a scribe, demanding to write letters of appeal. Her words poured out, not with the calm dignity of an empress, but with frantic passion. Claudius, husband, father of our children, remember Britannicus, remember Octavia, remember the nights we spent together. Do not let enemies poison you against me. I am still yours. Forgive, as you always have. One by one, her letters were carried away, though whether they reached Claudius at the palace, she did not know. Meanwhile, the emperor sat surrounded by his freedmen and generals, his face pale and drawn, Wine lay untouched before him. Narcissus entered quietly, bowing low, then producing the letters. Claudius took them with trembling hands, scanning the familiar handwriting. His lips quivered as he read. For a moment, tears filled his eyes. She begs forgiveness, he whispered. She speaks of our children. How can I kill the mother of my son? Pallas leaned forward gently, his voice measured but firm. Caesar, you must remember, this is no small betrayal. She has not merely strayed in passion. She has married another man. She has made herself empress to Silius while you still live. That is no wife's folly, but rebellion. If she lives, she will not stop. Claudius wept silently, torn between husband and ruler. His heart longed to call for her, to see her face and believe her words. Yet every time his lips moved toward mercy, Narcissus's cold voice cut in. Do not forget, Caesar. While you sit here in sorrow, she laughs at you in memory. She mocked you, married another, paraded herself as queen. Already Rome doubts if you are emperor or puppet. If she lives, they will say you are less than a man. If she dies, they will know you are Caesar. It was a cruel truth, and it pierced deeper than any sword. Back in her confinement, Messalina's confidence began to fray. She paced the marble floor, pulling at her hair, muttering half prayers, half schemes. At last, she begged that her mother, Domitia Lepida, be admitted. The older woman came reluctantly, her face shadowed with sorrow. Fanon. Mother, Messalina cried, falling to her knees. You must plead for me. Speak to Claudius, remind him of Britannicus. He cannot kill me, not when I am the mother of his heir. He is gentle, he will forgive. Tell him. Domitia's eyes glistened, but her voice was weary, almost resigned. A child, it is too late. You played too boldly, too recklessly. I warned you, power is not a toy. And Claudius, though soft, is surrounded by men who are not. They will not let him falter. Messalina grasped her mother's hands, desperation blazing. No, he loves me. He will see reason. I only need to speak with him once more. I can charm him. I can remind him. He will not let them kill me. Domitia looked away, her silence louder than any words. As dawn approached, Narcissus made his move. Knowing Claudius's wavering heart, he feared the emperor might yet summon Messalina for an audience, and that her beauty, her tears, her manipulative charm might sway him again. That could not be allowed. So Narcissus resolved to end it before mercy could breathe. He rode swiftly to the villa where she was kept, bringing with him a detachment of soldiers. The order he carried was vague, deliberately so. Claudius had spoken of removing Messalina, of ending the scandal, but had not spoken the word death. Narcissus supplied the word himself. Messalina, hearing footsteps approach, brightened suddenly. She believed Claudius had relented, that he had come for her, or at least sent for her to plead her case. Her hair was hastily arranged, her gown smoothed, her face composed into hopeful dignity. When Narcissus entered, however, hope faltered. His eyes bore no softness, only the cold certainty of a man executing necessity. Is it Claudius? She asked, voice trembling but eager. It is his will, Narcissus replied. She staggered back. No, he would not, he cannot. He loves me. But already the soldiers stepped forward, their faces grim. For the first time true terror seized her. The proud empress crumbled, pleading, sobbing, clutching at the hems of their tunics. Please, let me see him, only once. Let me hold my children. I will go to him. I will beg. He will forgive. He always does. Narcissus turned away, unwilling to watch. He had achieved what he intended. Claudius would never see her again, never risk being softened by her tears. One of the soldiers, pity flickering in his eyes, offered her a dagger. It is the Roman way, he murmured. Take your own life, spare yourself the shame. Messalina grasped it, staring at the blade through blurred eyes. For a moment silence hung. Perhaps she would choose the proud end, the stoic exit of Rome's noble women, but her hand shook violently. She pressed it against her breast, then let it fall with a cry. I cannot, she whispered. I cannot, the soldier sighed. With one swift motion, he did what she could not. Thus, in the gardens where she had once reigned with pleasure and laughter, Valeria Messalina fell. not as a queen surrounded by glory, but as a frightened woman undone by her own excess. At the palace, Claudius sat in uneasy silence. He asked, almost timidly, has she been brought? Narcissus returned hours later, bowing low. It is done, Caesar. Claudius's eyes closed, relief and sorrow mingling. For a moment he seemed older than his years, slumped by grief yet strangely freed from its chains. Rome whispered, then roared with the news. Some pitied, some mocked, some rejoiced that a dangerous woman was gone, but all agreed an era had ended, and Claudius, emperor yet widower, returned to his duties, haunted forever by the ghost of Messalina, Lena. The empress of lust and betrayal had fallen, not by enemies on the battlefield, but by her own ambition, her own recklessness, and the cold hand of those who had once served her. Chapter 8, Aftermath of a Fall, Part A. A palace of echoes. The day after Messalina's death, Rome seemed quieter than usual. The forum bustled, yes, senators exchanged greetings, merchants haggled, slaves ran errands, but beneath the noise was an invisible hush, a collective awareness that something immense had shifted. It was as though the city itself had drawn in a long breath and now held it, uncertain what would follow. News travelled fast. Already whispers twisted into rumour. She begged for mercy. She took her own life with Roman pride. She was cut down like a common criminal. No one knew the exact truth, for Narcissus had been careful to control the tale. Yet the substance of it was beyond dispute. Valeria Messalina, wife of the emperor, was no more. For Claudius the silence was more suffocating than noise. Ooh. He sat alone in the great dining hall, food untouched, goblet unlifted. The long marble table stretched before him, but where once Messalina had reclined, laughing and scheming, there was now only emptiness. Every corner of the palace seemed haunted by her presence, her voice echoing in memory, her scent lingering faintly on cushions, her laughter reverberating through the halls like a cruel trick of the air. He spoke little. When asked about matters of state, he gave distracted answers. When offered entertainment, he waved it away. He seemed not an emperor, but a weary old man wrapped in sorrow. And yet, even in grief, his freedmen did not let him rest. Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, they moved quietly, carefully, reminding him of duty. Rome must see you strong, they murmured. You must appear in the Senate, Caesar. You must reassure the guard. If you falter, others will seize advantage. Claudius nodded, but his eyes drifted, unfocused. Sometimes he muttered under his breath, words no one could hear. Other times he whispered her name. But when Britannicus and Octavia were brought before him, his sorrow deepened into something sharper, guilt. Britannicus, barely 8 years old, clung to his sister's hand. His face was pale, eyes wide with confusion. He understood little of politics, less of treason, but he knew one thing. His mother was gone. "Father," he whispered, voice small as a child's prayer. "When will Mama come back?" The question struck Claudius like a blow. He reached out, pulling the boy into his arms, pressing his lips to the child's hair. He could not answer. How could he tell his son that it was by his own command, or at least his own weakness, that Messalina had died? Octavia stood silent, older than her years, her face unreadable. She had inherited some of the steel of the Julio-Claudian women, and already she seemed to grasp what her brother did not. Their world had changed forever. She did not weep, at least not before her father. But when she bowed her head, Claudius saw the shine of tears on her cheeks. He dismissed them gently, sending them back to their tutors, then sat staring at the empty space they left behind. His children were orphans now, though still emperor's blood. Who would protect them? Who would guide them? Who would shape their future in a court where enemies lurked like wolves in shadow? Rome, for all its whispers, did not mourn long. The city had a way of consuming scandal and moving on, as though nothing could truly shock it anymore. Senators who had once fawned upon Messalina now distanced themselves, shaking their heads in feigned disapproval. Courtiers who had laughed at her banquets spoke instead of her a shameful downfall. Even friends vanished, as though she had never existed. But in private chambers, in candlelit corners, one question burned. Who would be next? The emperor could not remain unwed. A household without an empress was weak, vulnerable, unsteady. The children needed a mother, the palace needed a mistress, and Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, demanded stability. So names began to circulate. Noble women of good family, widows of senators, even a few bold maidens whispered by ambitious relatives. Yet none seemed to fit. Some were too obscure, some too dangerous, some lacking the prestige to stand beside an emperor. It was then that a new name began to rise above the rest, spoken first cautiously, then with greater boldness: Agrippina. Agrippina the younger, niece of Claudius, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula. A woman of sharp wit, iron ambition, and a lineage that shone brighter than any jewel. For years she had lived in the background, widowed, raising her son Lucius Domitius Ahonobarbus, the boy history would know as Nero. Yet those who knew her whispered of a fire in her, a hunger not unlike Messalina's, but colder, more calculating. She was no reckless seductress. She was a strategist, and so, even as Messalina's shadow lingered, the palace corridors began to buzz with a new current. Agrippina. Could she be the one to step into the void? Could she, perhaps, tame Claudius, guide the empire, secure her own son's future? For now, these were only murmurs. But like all whispers in Rome, they would grow. In the gardens of Lucullus, where Messalina had fallen, the flowers bloomed quietly, indifferent to human tragedy. Servants avoided the place, crossing themselves, whispering of ghosts. But history moved swiftly, and Rome cared little for the dead. Already eyes turned to the future, and Claudius, broken yet still emperor, stood at the crossroads of grief and necessity, where one woman's downfall would open the path for another's rise. Part be the rise of a new shadow. The Senate met in hushed tones only days after Messalina's death. Claudius appeared before them, a weary man whose shoulders seemed to sag beneath the weight of both empire and grief. He read decrees mechanically, his voice flat. He did not thunder like Augustus, nor command like Tiberius, nor strut like Caligula. He simply endured. Yet endurance in Rome was not enough. Behind the benches, freedmen whispered among themselves. Narcissus with his sharp eyes, Pallas with his calculating calm, Callistus with his air of control. Each knew the truth. The emperor was vulnerable. Left unguided, he could falter. Left unwed, his household could fracture. And so, one by one, they spoke to him in private. Caesar, Rome requires stability, Narcissus pressed, his voice insistent. An emperor without an empress is like a ship without anchor. Already factions stir, senators plot, families prepare their daughters. You must not let chaos return. Pallas added his logic. A Britannicus and Octavia need guidance. Without a mistress of the house, they will be pawns in others' hands. A new marriage is not indulgence, it is necessity. Callistus sealed the argument with flattery. The gods have spared you, Caesar. You remain Rome's protector. But even Jupiter keeps Juno at his side. Claudius resisted at first. He muttered of betrayal, of wounds not yet healed. Another wife, after her treachery? What woman could I trust now? His voice cracked, half grief, half disbelief, but freedmen were patient. They did not push too hard. They let the seed sink in. Meanwhile, in the private villas of Rome, a different conversation unfolded. Agrippina the younger sat in her chamber, dressed not in mourning black, but in imperial purple trimmed subtly into her gown, a daring choice for one not yet empress. Before her, tutors instructed her son Lucius Domitius. The boy listened half-heartedly, but Agrippina's gaze was far beyond the lessons. She had heard the news. She had watched Rome devour Messalina's name like a carcass picked clean by vultures, and in that empty space she saw opportunity. Her lineage was unimpeachable, daughter of Germanicus, the darling of Rome, great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. Few women could match such pedigree. Fewer still had her ambition. She rose, pacing the mosaic floor, her eyes glittering with calculation. A Claudius will need a wife. But not just any wife. He will need a shield for his children, a partner for his rule, a mother for his household. He will need me. Her ladies exchanged nervous glances, but none dared challenge her. Agrippina was not Messalina, whose beauty and appetite consumed her. Agrippina's allure was colder, sharper, more enduring. She wielded discipline like others wielded charm. Others will offer daughters, she continued, her voice steady. Senators, patricians, they will throw names like dice in a game. But none can offer what I can. The blood of Germanicus, the memory of Augustus, the future of Rome. Her gaze fell upon her son, who bent over his wax tablet with a frown. She moved to him, resting a hand on his shoulder. And you, my Nero, will be at the centre of it. Britannicus may be Claudius's son, but he is still a child. You are stronger. You are sharper. With me as Empress, you will not merely survive, you will rise. The boy looked up, uncertain, but Agrippina smiled. Not with warmth, but with the certainty of destiny. Back in the palace, freedmen debated the candidates. Some suggested noble widows, others fresh maidens from patrician families, yet none seemed suitable. The palace required not just dignity but also political strength. Narcissus, who had orchestrated Messalina's downfall, was wary of another powerful woman. He warned, beware ambition clothed in virtue. The wrong choice, and Rome may suffer anew, but Pallas, ever pragmatic, countered. And yet ambition, if guided, can be Rome's salvation. Agrippina carries both the prestige of Augustus and the loyalty of the army through Germanicus's memory. To bind her to Caesar is to bind stability to the throne. Callistus agreed. Besides, Caesar has always admired family ties. To bring his niece into the household would flatter his sense of tradition. At first, Claudius balked. The thought of marrying his own niece seemed unnatural, even scandalous. "It is against custom," he muttered. "Against the old ways, against the old ways." But the freedmen reminded him of precedent, of divine exceptions, of the Senate's power to bend law to necessity. And slowly, ever so slowly, Claudius yielded. Thus, as Messalina's memory faded into whispers, a new presence began to rise in Rome's imagination. Agrippina. Cold, brilliant, unshakable Agrippina. Where Messalina had seduced and played, Agrippina would command and reshape. Where Messalina had been reckless, Agrippina would be ruthless. She would not waste her power on banquets and lovers. She would use it to carve a future, for herself, for her son, and for Rome. And Claudius, weary and guilt-ridden, would find in her both comfort and cage. The downfall of one empress had opened the stage for another, and Rome, ever hungry for drama, awaited the next act. Chapter 9. The ascent of Agrippina Rome had seen many women pass through the marble halls of power, but none quite like Agrippina. She entered not with the intoxicating charm of Messalina, nor the tragic softness of earlier empresses, but with a steel composure that seemed unbreakable. To watch her walk through the corridors of the Palatine was to see a woman who already believed herself crowned. Claudius, weary from grief and age, became the stage upon which her drama would unfold. He did not resist her with the passion he had resisted Messalina's betrayals. Instead, he found in her presence a strange kind of reassurance. She spoke not as a lover, nor as a coy companion, but as if she were already a partner in governance. Where Messalina had distracted him with feasts, Agrippina steadied him with counsel. Yet behind this measured exterior lay ambition burning with relentless fire. It began quietly, with whispers in the Senate. The marriage between uncle and niece was without precedent in Rome. Scandalous, some muttered, against the mos maiorum, the sacred customs of the ancestors, but others pointed to Agrippina's bloodline, her direct link to Augustus, and her unmatched dignity to bear. Was she not the daughter of Germanicus, beloved of legions? Was she not the natural guardian of Rome's future? One by one, senators shifted their stance, guided by both persuasion and pressure. Freedmen, particularly Pallas, who had grown unusually close to Agrippina, ensured that the debate tilted in her favour. Rome needs stability, he urged in every chamber, and who better than the house of Augustus to secure it? Soon enough, what had seemed scandalous was reframed as divine necessity. The law could be adjusted. The gods, it was said, would smile upon such a union. Claudius, hesitant as always, was nudged by the chorus of voices around him until he accepted what seemed inevitable. No. To marry Agrippina would not only restore his household, but also tie his reign directly to the golden memory of Augustus. And so, in the year 49 AD, the marriage was arranged. Agrippina understood that this union was not the end of her rise, but the beginning. As Empress, she moved quickly to reshape the palace in her image. Messalina's lavish gardens and indulgent parties were curtailed. In their place came order, discipline, a kind of cold efficiency. Guests no longer whispered of lovers and games. They discussed policy, alliances, the machinery of empire. Where Messalina had made the palace a playground, Agrippina turned it into a fortress. But perhaps her greatest maneuver was the way she positioned her son. Lucius Domitius, still a boy in the eyes of many, was carefully rebranded as Nero Claudius Caesar, adopted by Claudius himself. Adoption in Rome was no small thing. It was a declaration of legitimacy, a rewriting of bloodlines. Britannicus, Claudius's true son by Messalina, had once stood unchallenged as heir, but with Agrippina's persuasion, Nero was suddenly elevated to equal standing, if not higher. She orchestrated everything. Nero's tutors, his public appearances, even the way he walked beside Claudius in ceremonies. The people saw him not as an outsider, but as the heir apparent shaped by destiny. The contrast was deliberate. Britannicus remained a child, shielded by his youth and innocence. Nero, however, was made to appear older, wiser, prepared for leadership. Agrippina saw to it that he was dressed in the toga of manhood earlier than usual, a symbolic act that marked him as Rome's future. And in the quiet chambers of the palace, she whispered into Claudius's ear, shaping his perception. "A Nero brings dignity to your reign. He is calm, disciplined. Unlike Britannicus, who still clings to boyhood games, Rome will look to Nero as your true successor." Yet not all were blind to her schemes. Narcissus, who had helped bring down Messalina, grew wary of Agrippina's control. He saw the way Claudius deferred to her, the way senators bowed a little lower in her presence, the way freedmen like Pallas seemed utterly devoted to her cause. But even Narcissus, sharp-eyed and suspicious, could not deny the results. Scandal diminished. Rome, it seemed, had found in Agrippina an empress not of pleasure, but of power. Still, beneath the polished marble surface, tension brewed. Britannicus and Nero represented two futures. Claudius, as ever indecisive, oscillated between them. And Agrippina, relentless, made sure that her son's star always burned brighter. For the people of Rome, the change was palpable. They had once laughed and whispered about Messalina's midnight games. Now they spoke in hushed awe of Agrippina's discipline. Temples invoked her as Augusta, her statues began to rise beside Claudius's, and her name was pronounced with reverence rather than mockery. But for those who knew the inner workings of the palace, one truth became clear. Messalina had played recklessly and lost, but Agrippina was playing a game far deeper, far deadlier. And unlike her predecessor, she did not intend to lose. Part A, the making of an heir. Agrippina's marriage to Claudius had already shifted the balance of Rome, but the true measure of her ambition was not her place beside the emperor. It was her ability to shape the future. She knew that empires did not rest on the shoulders of aging rulers. They lived or died through succession. And so, almost from the moment she became empress, her gaze turned toward the contest between two boys, Britannicus and Nero. The Senate was the first battleground. Senators, weary of scandals, welcomed Agrippina's severity. She attended their meetings not openly, but through influence, carefully chosen allies, family connections, and whispered promises. When decrees were passed, it was often her hand guiding the words, though her name was never written. She moved like a shadow in those marble halls, but her shadow grew long. Her lineage gave her unmatched authority. Whenever she needed to silence resistance, she invoked the name of Germanicus, her father. The golden son of Rome, mourned still by soldiers and citizens alike. No senator dared to dismiss the daughter of a man who had once embodied Rome's ideal. Soon statues of Agrippina began to appear beside those of Claudius, not as ornament but as statement. She was not merely wife, but partner in rule. Where Messalina had been mocked, Agrippina was honoured. The Senate voted titles for her, Augusta among them, giving her a dignity no woman had held in generations. The freedmen, too, bent toward her orbit. Pallas, especially, became her steadfast ally. It was whispered, though never proved, that their closeness went beyond politics, but whatever the truth, his loyalty was unquestioned. Through him, Agrippina reached deep into the machinery of finance and administration. Even Narcissus, ever suspicious, found himself unable to resist her influence completely. He had fought Messalina's chaos with cunning. Now he faced Agrippina's order, and order was harder to fight. Callistus, pragmatic as always, simply aligned with power, and power clearly flowed from Agrippina. But Agrippina knew that power could not rest in the present alone. The people of Rome, fickle and ever eager for spectacle, had to be shown their future. And so she began the careful elevation of her son. Lucius Domitius was no longer a mere boy. By decree, Claudius formally adopted him, renaming him Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The names themselves were banners of legitimacy. Claudius for his adoptive father, Caesar for the Julian line, Germanicus for the memory that Rome adored. Agrippina staged the ceremonies with theatrical precision. Nero was paraded before the people in a toga virilis, the garment of manhood, earlier than his years might have allowed. The forum cheered as he stood beside Claudius, his posture rehearsed, his words measured. And in those moments, the contrast with Britannicus could not be ignored. Britannicus was still a child, his voice unbroken, his manner uncertain. He clung to tutors and nurses, while Nero walked with the confidence of a man. It was not merely chance, it was design. Agrippina had shaped every gesture, every appearance. She made sure Nero was seen at festivals, at sacrifices, at games. His face began to appear on coins beside Claudius's, a silent but powerful declaration of succession. Rome, hungry for order after Messalina's chaos, embraced the image. Here was a boy who looked like he belonged to the purple. Here was stability, continuity, destiny. Of course, whispers remained. Some muttered that Britannicus was the true heir by blood. Others feared Agrippina's grasp on power, her cold control over both emperor and heir. But whispers are weak against spectacle, and Agrippina understood spectacle better than anyone. She played the long game, and in every move, Britannicus was diminished. At banquets, Nero sat closer to Claudius. In processions, Nero wore richer garments. When the people cheered, Claudius lifted Nero's hand, not Britannicus's. The message was unmistakable. One boy was Rome's future, the other a fading shadow of the past. Agrippina did not leave even the smallest details to chance. Tutors were chosen for Nero, men of philosophy and rhetoric, men who could polish his words and posture. Poets were encouraged to sing of his promise. Sculptors carved him as if he were already Augustus reborn. And Britannicus, he was slowly edged out. His mother was gone, his father distracted, his allies silenced. He was left to watch as his place was stolen before his very eyes. For Agrippina, it was not cruelty but necessity. She did not hate Britannicus. She simply could not allow him to stand in her son's way. Rome had no room for rival heirs. In the stillness of night, as the lamps flickered in her chambers, Agrippina would sometimes watch Nero sleep. She saw not just her son but her creation, the embodiment of her will. Where Messalina had gambled and lost, Agrippina had planned and won. And though history would one day judge her harshly, in those years her triumph was undeniable. Part threads of the future, those of the future, by the time 2 years had passed since her marriage to Claudius, Agrippina no longer needed to maneuver in whispers. Her authority radiated openly, acknowledged in Senate decrees, echoed in the voices of freedmen, and seen in the daily rituals of the imperial household. Messalina's ghost had faded into rumour. Agrippina's presence was now marble and bronze. Statues rose in the forum, not only of Claudius but of his wife. A rare honour, a statement that the empire was guided by 2 figures, not one. Coins bore her profile, struck alongside that of the emperor, circulating through markets and provinces alike. Each denarius that passed through a soldier's hand or a merchant's purse carried her image as if to say, Agrippina rules with Claudius and Rome is stronger for it. The palace itself reflected her will. The chaos of Messalina's indulgence was gone. In its place came strict routines. Banquets became orderly, audiences formal, petitions processed with speed. Senators, who once mocked imperial women, now deferred to Agrippina as though she were a magistrate in her own right. Even Claudius, uncertain and slow to decide, leaned upon her with the dependence of habit. Where he faltered, she spoke. Where he hesitated, she commanded. She was no longer simply his wife, she was his voice. But her greatest triumph lay in the elevation of Nero. The boy was no longer merely Agrippina's son, nor merely Claudius's adopted heir. He had become Rome's public prince. Festivals were arranged where he sacrificed at the altars, cheered by crowds. He stood at Claudius's side during triumphal processions, the golden laurel shimmering above his brow. Poets sang verses that likened him to Apollo, youthful and radiant, destined to bring light after the dimness of old age. Britannicus, by contrast, was pushed to the margins. The son of Messalina remained in the palace, but in silence. His presence reminded Rome of scandal and betrayal, of a fallen empress whose name was still whispered with shame. Nero was heir in all but name. Britannicus was little more than an afterthought. Agrippina watched it all with calm satisfaction. She had achieved what few women in history had dared even to dream. She had taken the shattered ruins left by Messalina's downfall and rebuilt the empire's heart around herself and her son. She did not gloat. Triumph, for her, was not indulgence, but confirmation. She had always believed this moment would come. Yet in the silent corners of the palace, not everyone was content. Narcissus, who had once uncovered Messalina's schemes, saw the same seeds sprouting in Agrippina's discipline, ambition, control, and the dangerous sidelining of Claudius's blood son. He whispered warnings, but the emperor, lulled by habit and by Agrippina's steady hand, brushed them aside, and Britannicus himself, though still young, began to understand. He saw Nero lifted above him, the Senate cheering a boy who was not his father's true heir, a prue heir. He felt the coldness of a mother's absence, the helplessness of watching his future stolen by another's design. For now, Rome cheered Agrippina. The Senate obeyed her. The freedmen worked with her. Claudius relied upon her. Nero thrived under her guidance. It seemed unshakable, a golden balance forged from iron discipline. But history whispers even in triumph, and in those whispers was a warning. Power in Rome was never secure. The same people who once celebrated Messalina had torn her down. The same Senate that now flattered Agrippina could one day plot against her, and between two boys, Britannicus and Nero, there could never be peace forever. Agrippina had raised her son to the light, but shadows always lingered at the edges of empire. The stage was set. The future, though shaped by her will, was already trembling beneath unseen fault lines, for in Rome no ascent was final, and no dominance unchallenged. Chapter 10. The emperor's fading shadow. The year that followed seemed at first to promise stability. Rome prospered, its provinces quiet, its legions victorious. Claudius still sat upon the throne, signing decrees in his deliberate hand, presiding over Senate sessions with a scholar's patience. But beneath the surface, time was claiming him. The emperor had grown heavier, his gait slower, audiences exhausted him, and public appearances were shortened. At feasts he lingered less, retiring to his chambers with muttered complaints of fatigue. Once a man mocked for his stammer and his limp, Claudius now appeared less eccentric than fragile. Whispers stirred through the palace. The emperor was aging, his strength waning. For Rome this was not unusual. Emperors came and went, like torches passing in a procession. But for Agrippina, this was opportunity ripening into necessity. No longer did she move cautiously. The time for subtle influence was past. Now Agrippina commanded openly, as though she were already empress in her own right. She summoned senators to private audiences, their petitions granted not by the emperor's seal but by her nod. Freedmen who had once balanced one mistress against another, Pallas, Callistus, Narcissus, found themselves bending ever more toward her will. Even the Praetorian Guard, ever watchful of where true authority lay, began to treat Agrippina's word as law. And at the centre of her design stood Nero. The boy had grown into youth. Tall, graceful, with a voice trained for oratory and a face that caught the light, he was no longer just Agrippina's son. He was Rome's promise. Claudius, perhaps sensing his own decline, leaned upon him in ceremonies, parading him before the people as though already sharing imperial weight. Nero was given priesthoods, honours, and the right to appear in the Senate. His public image gleamed with Apollo's brightness, the artists and poets painting him as the dawn after Claudius's twilight, and Britannicus, still present, still breathing, but increasingly irrelevant. A boy eclipsed by a rising sun, hidden by the shadow of his mother's disgrace and by the deliberate machinery of Agrippina's propaganda. In the streets, common Romans murmured that the matter was settled. Nero would succeed Claudius. The boy they saw at the games, at the sacrifices, at the festivals, was their future emperor. Britannicus was scarcely mentioned except in whispers, like a fading name etched on crumbling stone, but not everyone was convinced. Narcissus, the loyal secretary who had once saved Claudius from Messalina's plots, saw history repeating itself. He warned the emperor that in neglecting Britannicus, he was abandoning his true bloodline to Agrippina's schemes. Claudius, weary and ailing, listened but answered with silence. Perhaps he feared his wife more than he trusted his own instincts. Thus the balance tipped further. Agrippina no longer plotted in corridors. She ruled in marble halls. Nero no longer waited in shadows. He walked in sunlight. And Claudius, fading with each passing day, seemed less a ruler than a relic, a man whose reign was already being measured by how swiftly it might end. The empire stood at the edge of transition. Rome's throne, though still occupied, had already begun to shift beneath its weary master. And in the wings, unseen yet inevitable, fate sharpened its blade. In the dim light of late afternoon, Claudius sat upon a couch in the palace gardens. The sound of water trickled from a marble fountain, the air heavy with autumn's cooling breath. Around him, busts of his ancestors stared silently, stone faces that seemed to mock his frailty. Agrippina entered with her usual grace, her robes trailing like flowing water, her eyes steady as a hawk's. She greeted her husband with a smile that was both affectionate and commanding. "Rome speaks of Nero," she said, arranging herself beside him. "They see in him strength, dignity, a prince worthy of empire. Your wisdom in raising him has been praised in every corner of the city. Claudius blinked slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a cup of watered wine. Appraised, yes, he muttered, his words broken by pauses. But too much praise, perhaps. He is still very young. Agrippina leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Youth ripens quickly under the sun of power, and Rome adores youth. They want to see promise, not age. You have given them that promise, my lord. Claudius turned his cloudy eyes toward her, and for a moment there was sharpness, like a dying flame refusing to be extinguished. A promise, he repeated, but promise can mislead. When I was young, they saw only weakness in me. Yet I sit here now, Emperor of Rome. Appearances can deceive. The silence between them thickened. Agrippina held her breath, sensing that his mind, so often clouded, had caught on some dangerous clarity. Claudius's gaze drifted toward the marble fountain, where a shadow rippled in the water. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and deliberate. Nero is bright, yes, too bright perhaps, but Rome has a son already. My son, Britannicus. He must one day take his rightful place. The words hung in the air like the toll of a funeral bell. Agrippina's smile did not falter, but her eyes hardened ever so slightly, the way steel glints beneath silk. She touched his hand as if to soothe him. Of course, my husband, she whispered. A Britannicus is your blood. His day will come, when the gods decree it. But within her chest a storm brewed. Claudius had spoken not as a weary husband under her sway, but as emperor, as father. And those words, though few, were dangerous. They were a reminder that Britannicus's claim could not be erased by pageantry or popularity. By pageantry or popularity. For Agrippina, this was not mere doubt. It was a threat. That evening, when Claudius withdrew to his chambers, she lingered in the corridors of the palace, her face serene but her thoughts ablaze. She saw in his fading health both opportunity and peril. Time was her ally, but also her enemy. If Claudius lived long enough to act on his sudden clarity, Nero's path could be blocked. If he died too soon, before the succession was secured, the Senate and Guard might rally around Britannicus as the natural heir. She needed not only to control the present, but to seal the future. And as she walked beneath the torchlight, the corridors seemed narrower, the shadows deeper, the statues of former emperors colder. For the first time, Agrippina felt the weight of urgency. Night fell over the Palatine with a hush. The palace lamps glowed like watchful eyes in the corridors, their flames bending in the draughts that whispered through marble halls. Agrippina moved quietly, her sandals making no sound on the polished floor. This was not the hour for ceremony or spectacle. It was the hour when power flowed in whispers. In a private chamber, away from the emperor's ears, her confidants waited. Pallas, smooth and calculating, adjusted his rings as though each stone held a secret. Callistus, the ever-practical freedman, leaned against a column, silent but observant. And Narcissus, Claudius's old guardian, sharp-eyed and suspicious, had not been invited. Agrippina entered with the calm of a goddess, but her eyes betrayed a storm. She did not sit. Instead, she stood by the flickering lamp, her shadow tall against the wall. The emperor grows weaker, she began softly. But weakness can still be dangerous. Today he spoke of Britannicus, spoke as though the boy must take his rightful place. The words lingered, heavy as lead. Pallas narrowed his eyes. Does he suspect your designs? Agrippina's lips curved, though not in amusement. He suspects more than he shows. Claudius has always been underestimated, and that is why he has survived so long. But time is pressing. Nero shines before the people, yet if Claudius shifts his favour, all could unravel. She paused, her gaze steady, her voice lowering to a near whisper. We cannot allow the emperor to live inconveniently long. A silence followed, not of shock, for these men were seasoned in the games of survival, but of calculation. Callistus rubbed his beard thoughtfully. Pallas inclined his head, his voice measured. A poison is swifter than suspicion, a dish of mushrooms perhaps. He favours them. Agrippina said nothing at first, only drew a slow breath, as if steadying the weight of the thought she had now spoken aloud. At last she nodded. Then it must be done. Quietly, inevitably, so that Rome does not see a crime, but the gods claiming an old man's life. Her eyes glinted in the lamplight, not cruel, but resolute, like a commander, accepting the necessity of sacrifice in war. The freedmen exchanged glances, the unspoken pact sealing itself in the hush of that chamber. Outside, the palace still slept, unaware that in the stillness of this night the fate of its emperor had already begun to turn. That evening, Agrippina returned to her chambers with her usual poise. Servants bowed, guards straightened, the Empress's face serene as moonlight. Yet within, her thoughts were ablaze. Claudius's words, "A Britannicus must take his rightful place," had struck her like an omen. She knew what had to be done, and soon, for to delay was to invite danger. And in Rome, delay had destroyed many before her, many before her. The days grew shorter, autumn sliding toward winter. In the palace gardens, the leaves turned brittle and gold, drifting down onto marble paths that had once echoed with triumphal processions. Claudius, wrapped in heavy robes, walked slowly among them, leaning on the arm of a servant. He moved like a man who felt the weight of years pressing against his shoulders. Yet in these last days he sought the company of his children. One afternoon he summoned Britannicus to his study, the boy barely into adolescence, his features carrying the sharpness of youth and the faint shadow of his mother, Messalina. Britannicus bowed deeply, his movements rehearsed, yet his eyes glowed with a boy's uncertainty. Claudius studied him for a long while, the lines on his face deepening. At last he placed a trembling hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember, boy," he whispered, his voice catching on the words, "emperors are made of patience, not only of patience, not only of blood. You must learn to wait and to endure." Britannicus looked at him with confusion, too young to grasp the full meaning. Yet in the boy's solemn nod, Claudius perhaps saw a flicker of the air he wished to leave behind. On another day, Nero stood beside him in the forum during a public ceremony. The crowd roared Nero's name as garlands were cast before his feet, and the boy, tall, graceful, already rehearsed in the art of spectacle, raised his hand in acknowledgement. Claudius watched him with a strange mixture of pride and unease. Later, in private, he murmured almost to himself, "The people love you, too much perhaps. They forget how swiftly love turns to fear. Be cautious, Nero. The empire devours its own favourites." Nero smiled politely, though his eyes gleamed with youthful confidence, or perhaps with the fire of his mother's ambition. Claudius, weary, said no more. At feasts Claudius sat between them both, his forked beard stained with wine, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted food to his lips. Britannicus, quiet, watched. Nero, practised, conversed easily with senators and generals. Between the two, Claudius seemed like a fading light. One flame barely begun, the other burning too brightly, and himself only the dim wick in the middle. Agrippina, meanwhile, observed all of this with eyes sharper than any historian's pen. She sat behind the emperor at banquets, her face serene, her jewels catching the torchlight. But in her heart, the plan was already woven tight. Every gesture of Claudius, every sudden moment of clarity, only deepened her resolve. He was too unpredictable, his heart too divided, his memory too sharp at times for comfort. When Claudius clasped Britannicus's hand, Agrippina's eyes narrowed. When Claudius cautioned Nero, her lips stiffened. Nero, her lips stiffened. She saw in these small moments not fatherly love, but seeds of danger, seeds that could sprout if he lived too long. And so, while the emperor sought farewell in quiet words, Agrippina sought certainty in silence. Her freedmen whispered in corridors, her cooks and servants prepared, her resolve hardened. Rome itself seemed unaware. The streets bustled, the markets sang with life, the arenas roared. Yet within the palace, fate was coiling, ready to strike. One night, Claudius lingered over his wine, speaking slowly to a circle of senators and generals. His words, half slurred, carried both wisdom and prophecy. "When I am gone, Rome must be careful. It is easy to choose a boy for emperor, more difficult to guide him. Let no one forget Britannicus. Let no one forget Britannicus. He is the son of my blood. He must have his day." The listeners bowed their heads respectfully, though few dared repeat such words beyond the banquet. Agrippina, seated at his side, offered him a sip of water and a serene smile. But in her mind, the decision was already sealed. Soon, the emperor's voice would fall silent forever. The evening came draped in calm, as if the gods themselves wished to lull the city into quiet before changing its fate. The torches along the Palatine corridors flickered softly, their smoke curling toward high ceilings. Within the palace, servants hurried with platters of food, the aroma of roasted meats and herbs mingling with the heavier scent of autumn rain drifting through open courtyards. Claudius, though weary, had agreed to dine. It was said he never could resist a feast, and never more so than when mushrooms, his favourite delicacy, were set before him. Agrippina knew this well. The banquet was smaller than usual. A few senators, a handful of freedmen, the imperial household. Musicians drummed faint notes in the corner, the sound more lullaby than celebration. Claudius sat at the head, his beard damp with wine, his eyes glazed from fatigue yet occasionally sparking with the old curiosity of a scholar who loved to observe. When the dish arrived, plump mushrooms glistening with butter and herbs, his face lit with a rare smile. "Ah," he murmured, lifting one to his lips. The food of the gods. Agrippina, seated beside him, watched with eyes calm and unreadable. She spoke softly, urging him to eat, her hand brushing his sleeve in a gesture of wifely care. Few noticed the tension beneath her poise. Fewer still suspected that the god's food had been touched by darker hands. Claudius ate heartily at first, his appetite always stronger than his body. The courtiers laughed politely, filling the hall with the illusion of ease. Yet as the minutes passed, a subtle change rippled through the emperor. His laughter grew uneven, his hand trembled as he reached for wine. A shadow passed across his face, as though the lamps had dimmed. Agrippina leaned closer, her voice low. "You are tired, my lord. Let me call the servants to guide you to rest." He nodded faintly, his words slurred. Yes, perhaps rest." The feast continued in murmurs as Claudius was helped away, carried to his chamber where the air was heavy with incense. He lay upon his couch, the golden embroidery of his blankets glinting under lamplight. For a moment he seemed to drift towards sleep, a sleep deeper than usual, as though the earth itself were tugging at him. Agrippina entered quietly, dismissing all but a trusted handful. She stood at the foot of the couch, her hands folded, her expression solemn. To those present, she was the dutiful wife, anxious for her husband's health. To herself, she was the guardian of Rome's future, ensuring the torch would pass not by chance, but by her will. Claudius stirred once, muttering something faint, a word, perhaps a name. Some later claimed he whispered a Britannicus. Others swore it was no more than the muddled speech of a dying man. Whatever truth, it was lost to the silence of the chamber. The night deepened. Servants moved like shadows, physicians whispered in corners, the lamps burned low. Outside, the city slept in ignorance, unaware that its emperor's last breath was drawing near, and in Agrippina's heart there was no wavering now. The plan had been set in motion, and Rome itself stood on the edge of an irreversible dawn. The hours of night stretched on, heavy and silent. In the emperor's chamber, only the faint crackle of oil lamps disturbed the stillness. Claudius lay upon his couch, his breathing shallow, uneven, like a tide withdrawing from the shore. His lips were pale, his hands cold. Physicians hovered, whispering diagnoses that changed with each hour. Indigestion, a sudden fever, a weakness of the stomach. Their words were less for cure than for comfort, spoken in low tones as though to soothe their own fear. Agrippina remained close. Her face was composed, her posture still as a statue. She touched her husband's brow with cool fingers, speaking softly, so only those nearest could hear. "A rest, my lord. The gods call the weary to their peace." Some claimed Claudius stirred then, his eyes opening faintly. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, fading into silence. A murmur escaped, perhaps a Britannicus, perhaps only a sigh. Then his head fell back against the cushions, and the chamber seemed to hold its breath with him. Moments passed. Then the stillness deepened into certainty. Claudius was gone. At first, no announcement was made. Agrippina forbade it. She ordered silence, the chamber sealed, the death hidden as though the emperor merely slept. Through the long night, she remained vigilant, her freedmen whispering around her, their eyes fixed on the future. Dawn crept slowly over Rome, the sky paling above the Palatine Hill. Only then did Agrippina allow the news to move, carefully, deliberately. "The emperor has passed," her servants whispered through corridors. "The emperor has gone to the gods." But almost in the same breath came another whisper, woven in like a thread. "A Nero is ready." Agrippina moved swiftly, her grief masked in ritual. She summoned the Praetorian Guard, their loyalty already secure. She spoke with the Senate, presenting Nero not as a choice but as the obvious heir, the youth whom Claudius himself had honoured and elevated. Britannicus was mentioned, yes, but only as a boy, too young, too unsteady, unfit for the burden of empire. Nero, by contrast, was already a man in the eyes of Rome, groomed for this very hour. The machinery of succession turned smoothly, guided by Agrippina's unseen hand. By midday the city knew, word spread from the forum to the Subura, from the taverns to the temples. "A Claudius is dead," the people said. "A Nero reigns." Some mourned, some cheered, most simply continued their day, for Rome had learned long ago that emperors pass, but Rome endures. In the palace, Agrippina stood beside her son, her hand resting lightly on his arm as he was acclaimed. To the people, it was the image of maternal devotion, an empress guiding her son. To those who knew better, it was something else entirely, the triumph of a will so unbending that even an emperor's death had become part of her design. Claudius was gone. Nero had risen. And Britannicus, once the rightful heir, stood in the shadows, his future already shrinking before it could begin. History had turned its page in silence, with the bite of a mushroom in the quiet of a single night. And Rome marched forward, unaware that with this dawn it had stepped into a darker age. Chapter 11. The Mother and the Boy, Emperor Pater, a throne divided in shadow, approx. 1,500 words. The city of Rome had awakened that morning to a strange silence. Claudius was gone, his long, hesitant rule ended in the stillness of the night. In his place stood a youth of 16, crowned in laurel, dressed in purple, his features delicate and handsome. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, known now as Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The crowd cheered his name, but their voices carried a note of curiosity more than devotion. Could this boy truly rule the empire? Could the weight of legions, provinces, and laws rest upon such narrow shoulders? Behind him, almost unseen yet unmistakable, stood Agrippina the Younger. Her presence was not ceremonial, it was commanding. She had orchestrated every moment of the transition, the delay in announcing Claudius's death, the Praetorian Guard's oath to Nero, the Senate's smooth acceptance. The boy was emperor in title, but the woman beside him was emperor in truth. In the first months, Rome witnessed an unusual spectacle, the empire led by a mother and her son. Coins were struck with Nero's youthful profile, yet Agrippina's influence could be seen in every decree, every appointment, every whisper in the palace halls. She sat beside Nero when envoys from distant provinces offered tribute. She received ambassadors in her own right, a practice almost unthinkable for a woman in Rome. Senators, who had once treated imperial wives as silent ornaments, now bowed their heads in her presence. In the Senate, her hand was invisible yet heavy. Freedmen ministers, Pallas, Narcissus's rivals, and others long cultivated by Agrippina, carried out her will. Orders went forth in Nero's name, but always after Agrippina's approval. It was said that when Nero signed his first edicts, Agrippina stood over his shoulder, guiding his hand across the parchment. The young emperor himself seemed content with this arrangement, at least at first. He was raised in luxury, nurtured on poetry, music, and the softer arts. Politics, war, law, these were things his mother could manage. Nero preferred the lyre to the sword, verse to decrees. Agrippina encouraged this. Let the boy charm the people with his beauty, his voice, his promises of games and generosity. She would govern in his stead, said. Together they presented a portrait of harmony, a dutiful son and a vigilant mother, steering the empire as one. But harmony in Rome was always fragile. From the shadows came the murmurs of discontent. Some senators whispered that Britannicus, Claudius's true son, had been cast aside too soon. Others murmured that the empire was now ruled not by Augustus's heir, but by a woman descended from Germanicus, yes, but still a woman. The Praetorian Guard, bought and bound by Agrippina's gold, held firm loyalty. Yet soldiers muttered that their emperor was too young, too soft, too silent, and that his mother's eyes were always watching. Agrippina, however, thrived in this atmosphere. She appeared in public more boldly than Livia had ever dared. She rode in a gilded carriage, her name inscribed on monuments, her image stamped into coinage alongside her son's. She was proclaimed Augusta, a title of divine majesty. No mother before had shared such open power with her son. To Rome, it was shocking. To Agrippina, it was destiny fulfilled. Meanwhile, Nero's world grew stranger. At feasts he was flattered as the rising Apollo, the youthful god of arts. At the theatre, poets dedicated verses to his beauty. He sang and the people clapped. He spoke, and the crowds cheered. Yet in private, he remained under the stern gaze of his mother. His tutor, the philosopher Seneca, sought to balance this, encouraging Nero toward justice, clemency, and wisdom. The commander of the guard, Beryl, lent discipline and gravity. For a moment, it seemed Rome had achieved the ideal, a young emperor guided by philosophers, soldiers, and his vigilant mother. But beneath the golden surface, cracks began to show. Nero was restless, eager for pleasures his mother disapproved of. Agrippina was possessive, unwilling to loosen her grasp even as her son grew older. Every triumph of Rome became a quiet struggle between them, a struggle no one yet dared to name aloud. Part B. A fragile harmony approx. 1,500 words, the early months of Nero's reign unfolded like a stage play written by Agrippina's hand. Where Claudius had often seemed hesitant, mocked by his freedmen, and doubted by the Senate, Agrippina ruled with absolute clarity. She had prepared for this moment all her life, and she wasted no time. It was said that when foreign ambassadors arrived from Parthia, Armenia, or distant kingdoms of Africa, they found themselves not only saluting the young emperor, but bowing also to his mother. Agrippina sat behind a silken curtain in the palace audience chamber, sometimes veiled, sometimes unveiled, but always visible enough to remind all envoys that Rome's empire was not merely led by a boy, but guarded by a woman of iron will. On one occasion, when a visiting prince hesitated at offering his homage, Agrippina herself stepped forward, seated upon a throne equal in height to Nero's. The court scribes recorded the gasps. No empress before had dared to sit in such a place of equality, but Agrippina did not flinch. She received tribute, spoke of Rome's glory, and dismissed the envoy with the dignity of an emperor. The Senate, too, felt her presence like a heavy shadow. Decrees that bore Nero's seal had passed first through scrutiny. She wrote letters in his name, reviewed military appointments, and ensured her allies were placed in key positions. Freedmen loyal to her carried messages from the palace to the forum. Her face, carved into statues, appeared in temples beside Nero's, a divine pairing of mother and son. For a while, the senators tolerated it. After all, Agrippina was the daughter of Germanicus, the great general beloved by the people. Her blood carried the legacy of Augustus himself. Perhaps they reasoned it was natural for a youth of 16 to lean upon his mother's guidance. And yet, beneath the polite silence of the Curia, resentment brewed. Rome had never accepted the idea of a woman wielding naked authority. Nero, meanwhile, basked in the luxuries of youth. The empire adored his appearance, tall, golden-haired with the soft features of Apollo. He had inherited little of Claudius's stammering awkwardness. Instead, he appeared vibrant, eager, filled with artistic fire. Music was his greatest delight. Seneca, ever cautious, tried to encourage noble pursuits. Philosophy, rhetoric, governance. Burrus pressed him toward military training, reminding him that an emperor must command legions, not audiences. But Nero preferred the theatre to the camp, the lyre to the sword. He spent hours composing verses, singing with his tutor's lyre, dreaming of applause not from the Senate, but from the crowds of Rome's amphitheatres. Agrippina smiled at first, tolerating these amusements. She had no wish to crush his spirit. A charming emperor was a useful emperor. His beauty, his voice, his youth. All could be fashioned into symbols of a golden age. She even arranged private performances where Nero's singing could be admired by select courtiers, ensuring the whispers of his divine gifts spread across the city. But soon Nero began to test the edges of his freedom. He stayed longer at banquets, drank more deeply, surrounded himself with friends of his own choosing rather than his mother's. He listened less attentively when she issued instructions. And once, when Agrippina scolded him sharply for neglecting an official duty, Nero retorted, softly, yet with steel in his voice, that he was the emperor, not merely her pupil. The words stunned those present. Agrippina's face betrayed nothing, but her eyes glimmered with a warning. For now she let the comment pass. Yet in that moment, Rome's dual throne revealed its first crack. Amid these subtle struggles, another shadow lingered, Britannicus, the true-born son of Claudius and heir by blood. Barely 14, he was quiet, pale, and often sickly. Yet he carried the legitimacy of Claudius's line, a living reminder that Nero's rise had not been inevitable. At public ceremonies, Nero towered in purple robes while Britannicus, in plain white, stood at the edges like a forgotten relative. Agrippina spread rumours of his weakness, his inability to rule, his childishness. Still, sympathy grew. Senators muttered that Britannicus, not Nero, was Claudius's rightful heir. Old friends of the late emperor remembered him fondly, speaking of his kind manners, his resemblance to Germanicus. The people, ever drawn to stories of the overlooked, whispered about the boy unjustly displaced. One evening at a palace banquet, Britannicus sang a hymn in honour of his father. His clear young voice, trembling but sincere, filled the hall. Some guests wept quietly. Nero smiled tightly, but Agrippina's jaw clenched. She saw the danger. Even this small act of innocence could sway hearts. For Agrippina, there could be no rivals. Britannicus was a living threat to everything she had built. And yet, Even she could not control the tide of time. Nero grew older each day, more eager to assert himself. Britannicus grew too, each inch of height a reminder that Claudius's son was nearing manhood. The Senate's patience wore thinner with every decree stamped with Agrippina's hand. Rome tolerated a mother's rule while her son was a boy. But what of when he became a man? Agrippina sensed this danger. She tightened her grip, appearing more boldly at state functions, ensuring her presence was felt in every decision. She forbade Nero from private audiences without her. She dismissed friends she deemed unworthy, cutting Nero off from influences beyond her control. The boy emperor endured, but in his heart he began to resent the golden cage. To him, Rome was a stage, and he longed to perform freely. But Agrippina held the script, and she would not let him improvise. So the empire marched forward under this uneasy balance. To the public eye, it was harmony. The mother who guided, the son who ruled. Statues shone, coins glittered, and Rome boasted of stability. But behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. Senators asked how long the boy would submit. Soldiers wondered when Britannicus might step forward. Courtiers traded gossip. Was Nero still obedient, or did he chafe under his mother's control? Could Agrippina maintain such dominance forever? The answer hung in the air, unspoken but inevitable. History had shown that Rome devoured balance. Two rulers could not long share one throne, whether brothers, generals, or mother and son. The empire tolerated no equals, and though the people cheered Nero's youth and Agrippina's majesty, a shadow of doom crept slowly toward the palace. Chapter 12. A Son Against His Mother, Part A. The cracks widen, approximately 1,500 words. The shimmering facade of harmony could not last. By Nero's second year on the throne, the illusion of a united empire, mother guiding, son ruling, began to fracture. Agrippina, always vigilant, sensed the subtle changes. Where once Nero bowed his head at her counsel, now he delayed his answers. Where once he welcomed her presence in audiences, now he dismissed her with excuses. At banquets, he allowed his friends to linger longer than she approved, and when Agrippina scolded him, his replies grew colder, sharper, sharper. The boy was becoming a man. Agrippina responded as only she knew how, with tighter control. She stationed her spies among Nero's companions, silenced those who mocked her authority, and reminded the Senate that she alone was guardian of the Julio-Claudian legacy. Yet each move seemed only to deepen her son's resentment. The first open clash came over Nero's private friendships. Among his companions was Otho, a dashing young aristocrat known for wit and charm, and for encouraging Nero's taste for excess. Agrippina despised him. She warned her son that such frivolous company would shame the throne. Nero, in turn, defended Otho with unusual defiance, declaring that he would choose his own friends. The court was stunned. Agrippina had long silenced opponents with a glance, yet here was the emperor himself standing firm. Though she let the matter drop in public, her fury burned in private. For Agrippina, this was not mere rebellion, it was betrayal. Meanwhile, another storm gathered. Britannicus. The boy was nearly 15, his features sharpening into the likeness of his father. His presence at court, though diminished, carried a quiet dignity. At times he sat silently during ceremonies, his gaze fixed on Nero, not with open hostility, but with the solemn patience of one who knew the truth. He was Claudius's true son, Rome's rightful heir. Agrippina knew this truth as well, and it gnawed at her. She had elevated Nero above him, but legitimacy was a fragile thing. A careless whisper, a soldier's doubt, a senator's defection, and the boy might suddenly shine as Rome's alternative. Already in hushed corners of the city, voices murmured that Britannicus, not Nero, was Claudius's chosen successor. The danger grew so palpable that even Nero himself began to feel uneasy. At feasts, when Britannicus spoke, guests listened with sympathy. When he prayed at his father's shrine, crowds gathered. For the first time, Nero realized that Britannicus's existence cast a long shadow across his throne. Agrippina, ever ruthless, pressed her son. "Do not forget, child, that power is not secured by birthright alone, but by removing threats before they grow." Her words, though cold, planted a seed. Nero, who had once recoiled at the thought of violence, now saw Britannicus not as a brother, but as a rival. The palace became a theatre of tension. Nero avoided Britannicus in public, while Agrippina whispered strategies of removal. Seneca urged mercy, counselling that magnanimity would prove Nero's greatness. Burrus, more cautious, warned that any rash act could turn the guard against him. but youth is impatient and fear more persuasive than reason. The breaking point came one evening at a banquet. Britannicus, seated at the far end of the table, raised his cup to toast the emperor. His voice was clear, respectful, but his words carried weight. "To my brother, may he rule as my father wished." The hall fell silent. Some guests shifted uneasily, others dared to glance at Nero. The implication was obvious. Britannicus had not called him merely emperor. He had invoked Claudius's will, a subtle reminder of his own claim. Nero's face hardened. Agrippina's eyes narrowed. That night, whispers spread across the palace. Britannicus had signed his own death warrant. Agrippina might have once orchestrated such a deed herself, but now Nero insisted upon it. Whether to prove his independence or to silence his rival forever, he resolved that Britannicus must die. His youth, his beauty, his claim, all were too dangerous to ignore. Within weeks the plot was arranged. A poisoned cup, served in the midst of laughter, would end the boy's life. Rome would awaken to find Britannicus gone. His death blamed on illness, his memory smoothed over by imperial decree. The stage was set. The harmony of mother and son had transformed into conspiracy and blood. And so, the fragile balance that had once dazzled Rome tipped into darkness. Part B. The poisoned cup, approximately 1,500 words. The palace dining hall glowed with torchlight. Golden lamps cast shimmering circles upon marble walls, while the air filled with the mingled scents of roasted meats, honeyed wine, and the soft perfume of roses scattered across the floor. 'Twas a night meant for harmony. A banquet in honour of the emperor's youth, an evening to display Rome's stability under its boy ruler. Senators reclined upon couches, courtiers laughed in measured tones, musicians plucked gentle strings. At the centre sat Nero, crowned in a wreath of laurel, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. Beside him, as always, was Agrippina, radiant yet stern, her eyes surveying every corner of the room. And at the far end of the table reclined Britannicus, pale, reserved, his presence both tolerated and dangerous. The boy had grown taller, his voice deeper. Though still young, he carried himself with the dignity of Claudius's son. Every movement reminded those present that another heir lived, one with a stronger claim than Nero. The plan was simple. A servant, bribed and instructed, would present Britannicus with a cup of wine laced with poison, tasteless, colourless, swift. It would be explained away as an epileptic seizure, a sudden fit of weakness. After all, the boy had suffered such episodes before. The musicians played louder as the first courses were served. Guests murmured politely, trying not to betray their tension. Many had heard rumours that something was amiss. The court was a nest of whispers. Word of danger often preceded the act itself. Agrippina's gaze was fixed upon her son. Would he falter? Would he command the deed with steady hand or with trembling youth? She herself had arranged poisons in the past, yet this was Nero's decision, his mark upon history. At last a moment came. A slave approached Britannicus with a golden cup. The boy accepted it without suspicion, raising it in casual salute to his stepbrother. "To the emperor," he said softly. "Yeah." The words carried through the hall. Some guests smiled uneasily, remembering his last toast, the one that had stung Nero like a blade. Britannicus drank. A heartbeat passed. 2, 3, then the boy stiffened. His hand jerked, spilling wine upon the table. His eyes widened, his lips twisted, and his body convulsed violently. The hall erupted in cries. Musicians faltered. Senators rose from their couches in shock. "An epileptic fit," cried one of the attendants, the line prepared in advance. "He has always suffered from these." But the protest rang hollow. Too many eyes had seen the suddenness, the unnatural violence of the seizure. Britannicus gasped, his body trembling, then fell back limp upon the couch. Silence followed, a heavy, suffocating silence. The boy was dead. All eyes turned to Nero. Eyes turned to Nero. The emperor remained motionless, his hands clenched tightly upon the table. His face, pale beneath the lamplight, betrayed both triumph and terror. He had expected relief, perhaps even joy. Instead, he felt the weight of a life ended, a brother's life, extinguished by his own command. Agrippina, seated beside him, betrayed no outward shock. Yet, within her breast, conflicting storms raged. Part of her was satisfied. Britannicus had always been a threat, and now the danger was gone. But another part trembled. The deed had not been hers, it had been Nero's. For the first time, her son had acted in ruthless independence. Was this a sign of his maturity, or a warning that he no longer needed her guidance? Around the hall, reactions varied. Some courtiers forced nervous laughter, pretending to believe the tale of illness. Others whispered frantically, their eyes darting toward the lifeless body. A few senators, bolder than the rest, stared directly at Nero, their faces pale with horror. The Praetorian Guard, ever disciplined, stood unmoving, their silence more telling than words. They had seen poison before. They knew the truth, but their loyalty lay with the emperor, and by extension with survival. The feast continued in uneasy pretense. Servants cleared Britannicus's body quietly, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Wine was poured again, musicians resumed their playing, and laughter returned in stilted bursts. But the air had changed. Every guest knew that a boundary had been crossed. An emperor who would kill his own brother, even one disguised by ceremony, was an emperor to be feared. That night, Nero retreated to his chambers in silence. He dismissed his attendants and sat alone, staring at his trembling hands. He had ordered the death, yes, but had he commanded the poison? Or had the poison commanded him? Seneca visited quietly, urging calm. He spoke of necessity, of security, of Rome's need for stability. It was fate, he murmured. The empire cannot afford two heirs, but Nero barely listened. The boy within him wrestled with the deed, while the emperor struggled to accept it. Agrippina entered soon after, her voice smooth, her face unreadable. She praised him faintly, as though he were a child who had taken his first steps. Yet her heart quivered. Britannicus's death had freed Nero, but also freed him from her. If he could order such a killing, he could just as easily order against her. For the first time, Agrippina felt not power, but fear. Rome awoke the next morning to the news. Britannicus was dead, claimed by sudden illness. The official announcement spoke of a seizure, a tragic but natural passing. Public mourning was brief, orchestrated, carefully muted. Statues of Nero were adorned, while Britannicus's memory was already fading into silence. Yet, in the hearts of many, suspicion lingered. Mothers whispered the tale to their sons. Senators recorded the truth in hidden scrolls. The people, cynical and sharp-eyed, knew the pattern of palace poison when they saw it. The empire had taken another turn into darkness. For Nero, the act was irreversible. He had shed blood not in battle, but at a banquet, not upon an enemy, but upon his brother, Rusbio. It was the first true mark of his reign, carved not in marble, but in death. Agrippina, watching from her gilded chambers, understood the change. The boy she had moulded was no longer hers to command. He had crossed a threshold into manhood, but not the kind she had hoped for. He had tasted power sharpened by blood, and she, who had once held him tightly in her grasp, now saw the shadow of rebellion in his eyes. The dual throne of Rome, mother and son, was breaking apart, and in its place a darker struggle would rise. A son who no longer wished to share power, and a mother who refused to release it. The banquet of Britannicus had been more than a death. It was a declaration. Rome braced itself, for the harmony of the past had ended. The empire now entered an age of suspicion, whispers, and war between parent and child, and all knew, when family becomes rival, Rome itself becomes the battleground. Chapter 13. Shadows of rebellion and the breaking of the throne. The palace, once a scene of orchestrated harmony, now trembled under the weight of tension. Nero had grown restless, his appetite for power and pleasure colliding with the iron will of Agrippina. Where once mother and son presented a united front, now whispers of dissent and glances of defiance filled the corridors. Nero's mornings began later. His afternoons spent in music, poetry and performances that irritated Agrippina to no end. The lyre, once a symbol of youthful charm, became his instrument of defiance. He performed for select friends, flaunting freedom from maternal oversight. Courtiers whispered of clandestine rehearsals, of songs with veiled barbs against the mother who had raised him. Agrippina, for her part, sought to reassert control. She summoned senators, reminded the freedmen of her authority, and issued edicts in Nero's name to display command. Yet cracks appeared. Burrus, the loyal prefect, tried to mediate, urging caution. Freedmen who had once obeyed without question now saw opportunity in Nero's growing independence. Nero's charm and beauty began to command loyalty of their own. Musicians, poets, and actors flocked to his side, admiring the youth who dared to defy his mother publicly. Rome, as ever, loved spectacle, and the boy emperor's private performances began to attract attention beyond the palace walls. The first open clash occurred during a banquet celebrating the return of legions from Germania. Agrippina attempted to preside alongside Nero, seated at equal height, commanding attention as she had so long. But Nero, for the first time, refused to rise when she entered, dismissing her gesture with a subtle but unmistakable movement. Murmurs spread among the senators and generals. The emperor was asserting himself. "A mother, you may sit, but I will conduct the evening," he said softly, yet firmly, his voice carrying across the hall. The audacity stunned the courtiers. Agrippina's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes cold as ice, yet no outburst came. She left masked with dignity, yet internally the fire of anger and fear burned bright. Agrippina's isolation grew. Freedmen, sensing the tide turning, began to gravitate toward Nero. Even those who owed allegiance to her in past years now hesitated. She realized too late that Rome's machinery could not be controlled by fear alone. The emperor's personal magnetism, charm, and artful defiance were pulling power away from her. Meanwhile, Nero indulged in passions that marked his rule. Theatre became a stage for his growing ego. Music, poetry, and chariot races displayed his grandeur. Yet, with indulgence came cruelty. His first private executions were quiet, veiled, but deliberate. Servants who displeased him, friends who betrayed minor slights, whispers in corridors that challenged his authority. He learned, swiftly and painfully, the intoxicating effect of absolute power. Britannicus's death had already cleared a path, but Agrippina remained a lingering threat. She advised, manipulated, and guided, and yet her influence waned. Nero began making decisions without her counsel: appointments of generals, rearrangement of palace posts, the granting of favours. Each small act chipped away at her authority. Senate and court whispered. Some praised the boy for his independence, others feared the breaking of tradition. Rome watched, captivated, unaware that behind the smiles and performances a family was tearing itself apart. The tension reached a peak during a visit to the Temple of Jupiter. Agrippina attempted a public display of unity, positioning herself alongside Nero as the divine mother and son. But Nero ignored her presence, stepping forward to address the people and army alike. He spoke not in deference, but with command. His voice, clear and confident, carried across the forum. "Rome looks not to the past, but to the future. I will lead you with strength, and none shall obstruct the path of the empire." Agrippina's pride flared, yet her control slipped further. Even in the presence of the gods, she could no longer assert dominance over her son. The dual throne had shattered. The palace and city both recognized it. The city itself responded. Poets sang of Nero's youthful brilliance. Citizens murmured about the boy emperor's charm and musical talent. The Senate, though outwardly cautious, began to see Nero as an independent force. Agrippina's carefully orchestrated influence, once absolute, diminished visibly with each public defiance. Nero's personal passions, once tolerated, became instruments of political maneuvering. Each act of performance, each display of charisma, pulled allies and resources to his side. Agrippina could no longer command unquestioned loyalty. The mother who had raised and manipulated the boy now watched as the empire shifted around her. Fear and admiration, once her tools, now strengthened her son's independence. Rome, enthralled, sensed the change. The boy emperor was no longer a child beneath his mother's wing. He was a ruler in his own right, and shadows of rebellion had entered the palace. The chapter closes with quiet foreboding. The dual throne, the fragile harmony that had dazzled Rome, had ended. Agrippina's isolation, Nero's newfound boldness, and the court's shifting loyalties foreshadowed further conflicts. Rome's golden halls now echoed with whispers of rebellion. Artistry turned into assertion, and ambition that would not be constrained by familial bonds. History had reached a point of irreversible tension. The stage was set for tragedy, for cruelty, and for the ultimate clash between mother and son. Rome's empire had changed, quietly, subtly, yet forever. Chapter 14. The Emperor alone the palace, once alive with the carefully orchestrated duality of mother and son, now felt hollow. Shadows stretched long across the marble floors, echoing the absence of the harmony that had once masked ambition. Agrippina, who had shaped and steered the boy emperor for years, now found herself in an unfamiliar position, the architect of a throne she no longer controlled. Nero moved through the halls with the ease of one who had discovered the intoxicating power of autonomy. No longer did he seek his mother's approval for decisions. Military appointments, distribution of wealth, public entertainments, and subtle manipulations of senators were carried out at his sole discretion. Each decree, each action announced quietly but unmistakably that Rome's boy, emperor, had become a ruler in his own right. Agrippina's influence waned with each passing day. Freedmen who once obeyed her without question shifted allegiance to Nero, sensing opportunity in the boy's charisma and newfound decisiveness. Even the Praetorian Guard, the ultimate instrument of imperial power, pledged their loyalty firmly to Nero, leaving Agrippina increasingly isolated. Her attempts to guide, to warn, to manipulate all had less effect. She attempted one last maneuver, a formal audience with senators, invoking her legacy as the daughter of Germanicus, the widow of Claudius, and the mother of the emperor. But her speech, intended to cement authority, fell flat. Senators, cautious and calculating, received her words politely, yet their eyes lingered upon Nero, who smiled faintly, seated at a slight distance, unconcerned by his mother's diminishing clout. Nero's passions, once mere youthful indulgences, now merged with governance. Theatre, music, and poetry became instruments of subtle influence. He surrounded himself with allies of his own choosing, favouring men who admired him personally rather than those loyal to Agrippina. The performances he staged were elaborate, carefully orchestrated displays that reinforced the emperor's power and subtly undermined the remnants of his mother's authority. He even began to experiment with cruelty, a taste he had acquired after Britannicus's death. Minor acts of punishment, carefully calculated to instill fear without provoking rebellion, marked the first steps of Nero's darker side. Courtiers learned that disobedience would be met not with words but with consequences. Agrippina, sensing the shift, became increasingly desperate. She attempted to sway the young emperor through counsel, flattery, and subtle threats. Yet Nero's confidence grew. He tolerated her presence, allowed her to advise in ceremonial matters, but refused her the final word. The court noticed. The mother who once dominated the palace now appeared sidelined, a figure of fading authority. The tension reached a point of inevitable confrontation. Nero began to take steps to remove her influence permanently. He ordered loyal servants to monitor her actions, to report any hint of plotting or dissent. Meetings were increasingly held without her knowledge, decisions made behind closed doors. Agrippina, ever shrewd, sensed that the endgame had begun, but even she could not anticipate the extent of her son's resolve. The public, as always, responded to spectacle. Nero's music, poetry, and public appearances captivated the people of Rome, who marvelled at the young emperor's genius and charisma. His growing independence, once cause for whispered concern among senators, became a symbol of new vitality for the empire. Agrippina's fading influence, though clear to those within the palace, was hidden from the masses. The balance of power had shifted quietly but irrevocably. In private, Nero's mind wrestled with both fear and exhilaration. The act of asserting independence had thrilled him, but he also recognized the dangers inherent in defying his mother. Yet he had tasted freedom, and there was no turning. Every act, every performance, every decree was now his alone. The stage was set for a final confrontation. Agrippina, ever ambitious, contemplated one last move to regain control. A network of loyalists whispered alliances with senators and potential threats to the young emperor. But Nero, anticipating her maneuvers, acted first. He orchestrated a series of careful steps to isolate her politically, remove her supporters, and ensure that any act of resistance could be suppressed swiftly. Rome, meanwhile, watched the palace unfold like a theatre. Allies and enemies alike sensed the inevitability of change. The emperor, once under the shadow of his mother, now cast his own shadow across the city. The dual throne, the fragile balance of power, had ended. Only one ruler remained. By the time the final act approached, Agrippina's position was untenable. She had lost control over freedmen, senators, and even the palace staff, who had once obeyed her without question. Nero had outmaneuvered her at every turn, his talents, charisma, and growing ruthlessness ensuring loyalty from those who might have betrayed him. Her only hope rested in a last desperate attempt at persuasion, yet Nero, now fully aware of his autonomy and power, would no longer be swayed. Rome itself seemed to recognize this shift. The streets buzzed with excitement at Nero's emerging dominance, the amphitheatres filled with cheering crowds, and the Senate, careful but observant, began to align themselves with the emperor's will. The transition was nearly complete. The mother who had once ruled alongside her son now faced the terrifying reality that the empire had slipped entirely from her grasp. And so, as chapter 14 opens its final pages, the empire moves inexorably towards the culmination of ambition, artistry, and cruelty. Nero, emerging from the shadow of his mother, prepares to consolidate absolute power. Agrippina, brilliant yet ultimately outmaneuvered, faces the peril that comes with losing favour in the palace. The city of Rome stands on the brink of a new age, one in which youthful ambition, ruthless calculation, and the intoxicating lure of power will determine the fate of all who dwell within the empire's golden walls. The stage is set for tragedy, betrayal, and the ultimate assertion of a single emperor over Rome. The throne alone, climax and conclusion, the summer sun burned low over the Palatine Hill, casting long, molten shadows across Rome's marble and brick. The city buzzed as always, merchants calling, children playing, soldiers marching. But inside the imperial palace, a different energy prevailed, one of tense calculation, of power measured and ruthlessly seized. Agrippina, once the guiding force of her Julio-Claudian empire, moved cautiously through her apartments. She knew the palace had shifted beneath her feet. Freedmen who had obeyed her instructions without question now answered only to Nero. Senators, once pliant to her influence, whispered cautiously in her presence, but took their true cues from the boy emperor. She had built her life upon manipulation and strategy, yet now she felt herself cornered, a matron observing the ascent of a son who would no longer tolerate her shadow over the throne. Nero, meanwhile, had embraced the intoxicating freedom of sole rule, where, once he had deferred, now he commanded. Advisors, courtiers, and generals approached him not as a boy guided by his mother, but as an emperor in full possession of his power. Even the Praetorian Guard, loyal by contract and appetite for favour, recognized the shift. The empire now had a single master. The first act in consolidating this power was subtle, precise, and chilling. Agrippina, who had once ordered poison and intrigue herself, now became the target. Nero, mindful of appearances yet driven by ambition, orchestrated a plan that would remove her influence permanently without arousing open revolt. The plot unfolded quietly. Loyal servants delivered messages, summoned allies, and prepared the stages of deception. Nero feigned deference and consultation, meeting with his mother as if their partnership continued. Agrippina, sensing opportunity, attempted to advise him, offering strategies, warnings, and guidance. But Nero smiled politely, hiding the resolve that had hardened in the months since Britannicus's death. On a humid afternoon, Nero invited Agrippina to a secluded villa on the outskirts of the city. The location was remote, the servants carefully selected. Once she arrived, he spoke with the soft tone of filial respect. "A mother, the empire requires us to act decisively. The past must be behind us. Rome looks to the future, and it must see no division." Agrippina, astute to the double meaning, hesitated. Her instincts whispered danger, yet she had misjudged her son's capacity for cold calculation. By evening, the plan was executed. The method was subtle, a carefully orchestrated drowning framed as accident. The emperor himself gave instructions to trusted men, ensuring no link would be traced back to him overtly. Agrippina, once mistress of intrigue, now became a pawn in a game orchestrated by her own son. The palace received word in hushed tones. Agrippina had perished. Official accounts framed it as misfortune, a tragic accident at a villa near Baiae. But the courtiers, servants, and freedmen who had witnessed Nero's quiet orchestration knew the truth. The boy emperor had acted decisively, and the throne was now unchallenged. Rome itself remained unaware at first. Public mourning was muted, ceremonies performed with solemnity, yet Nero appeared at the forum shortly thereafter, addressing citizens and senate alike. His voice was steady, confident, infused with youthful charm and a new authority. The empire endures. Rome looks to the future, united and strong. Let none doubt the will of its emperor. Applause rippled through the crowd, some genuine, some performed. Rome accepted the boy emperor as master, the mother who had once ruled alongside him fading into legend and whispers, with Agrippina removed. Nero's next steps were both practical and symbolic. Key freedmen loyal to her were dismissed or reassigned. Senators who had aligned with her influence now approached him with deference, eager to curry favour. The palace, once a divided stage of dual authority, now radiated the presence of a single ruler. Yet the consolidation of power came with blood. Minor enemies, rivals, former allies of Agrippina, and anyone perceived as a threat were quietly eliminated. Poison, exile, and public humiliation ensured that opposition could not coalesce. Nero, having tasted the authority of life and death, embraced the darker arts of rule. These acts, while discreet, sent a clear message. The emperor alone held the ultimate power in Rome, and mercy would not protect challengers. Psychologically, Nero's transformation was profound. The boy who had once strummed the lyre for amusement now understood that artistry could be a tool of influence. Music, performance, and public spectacle could manipulate hearts and minds as surely as sword or decree. Cruelty, too, had become a method, tempered by his charm. He recognized the intoxicating effect of absolute authority and the terrifying clarity of fear, both of which ensured obedience and cemented his sovereignty. Agrippina's removal, though complete, haunted him. Memories of her guidance, her intelligence, and her relentless ambition lingered in his mind. She had been teacher, mentor, and adversary all at once. Now, the empire would see only the emperor himself, but Nero's consciousness carried the weight of her shadow, a reminder that mastery often comes entwined with betrayal, and that power always demands sacrifice. Rome entered a new chapter. Streets, forums, and amphitheatres echoed with the young emperor's charisma. Senators, freedmen, and generals adjusted to a rule no longer moderated by maternal authority. The empire had stabilized outwardly, but whispers persisted in the corridors, tales of Britannicus, Agrippina, and the early acts of Nero's bloody consolidation. The golden halls of the palace reflected the unbroken sun of authority. The boy emperor, now fully alone, was master of Rome. Yet beneath the surface, currents of fear, ambition, and whispered revenge simmered. History had shifted irrevocably. The empire belonged to Nero, and he would rule with a blend of charm, cruelty, and artistry that Rome had never fully witnessed. The stage of power was his alone. The mother who had once ruled alongside him, the brother who had once been heir, the courtiers and freedmen who had once shaped decisions, all had been swept aside. Nero's reign, dazzling and dark, had begun. Rome exhaled. The dual throne was no more. The emperor, and the emperor alone, now cast the shadow over the city, the legions, and the empire itself. And somewhere deep within, the young ruler's eyes reflected the truth of absolute power. Mastery is intoxicating, but it is also lonely, bloody, and eternal.